For starters, this story is much less whimsical than the title might lead you to believe. What is a mugwump? The answer is, fuck if I know. Nor do I know where my aunt found one. My grandfather had always kind of spoiled Aunt Carol. She was the first girl born into the family and was a diva from day one. When my grandfather's cancer metastasized, it was like the martyr jackpot. She would call us at all hours of the day with some sob story about how poorly Dad was doing, and by implication, her. Meanwhile, the bulk of the actual care went to my Uncle Bob and my Aunt Amy. Carol used her dying dad as an excuse to monopolize every conceivable holiday. When Grandpa passed, the sigh of relief from the whole family could have caused a typhoon. We had hoped this would be an end to the holiday shenanigans. Apparently not. We were just in the doorway. My wife hadn't even gotten my youngest coat off when Carol bustled over.
Oh, it's so good you're finally here.
We were an hour early for dinner.
I wanted to make sure seating wasn't a problem. I need to sit by Clarence. You know, he can't eat on his own.
The name Clarence did not belong to any cousin I knew, and I could see from her face it was a baited hook to get me to ask who Clarence was. I ignored it and dealt with my kids before walking into the dining room and stopping short. What sat strapped to a booster seat was pink and fleshy and wet. It was the size of a toddler, completely hairless, with an oval opening for a mouth. Its bulging frog eyes had no visible whites, and not once did it stop wheezing through the whole night. "What the fuck is that?" I said, forgetting my rule against swearing in front of kids. Aunt Carol smiled smugly and fluffed the pillow behind it.
I found Clarence all alone. My poor little mugwump needs me. It's so nice to finally have something I can really care for.
Meanwhile, her adult son Kevin just looked downcast behind her. I'd never felt so much for the poor guy before.
What is that? Why is it at the table?
My wife wouldn't let it go.
I don't want it around my kids. It looks unsanitary.
My aunt's smug expression didn't waver.
Clarence needs special care. He's a special boy.
She cooed at the pink lump. I almost threw up right then and there. I don't even know how I made it to dinner. The thing about dysfunctional families is you get adjusted to weird shit really quickly. Something really fucked up is sprung on you, and you have a moment where you look at it and think, this is normal now. So my aunt had a mugwump, and it was sitting at the dinner table. Carol hadn't actually done any of the cooking at the house. My cousin Kevin's much beleaguered girlfriend had done the side dishes. Aunt Amy had done the turkey. Carol's contribution was some shitty centerpieces she'd picked up at Dollar General. And the horrible pink nightmare seated at the table, of course. No one was in the mood for dinner when all was said and done. It was an utter tragedy. We had show-perfect golden brown turkey, my wife's patented bacon beans, and even my oldest daughter had baked a loaf of French bread. And we couldn't touch a bite of it because Carol decided Clarence had to be served first. She fetched the baby food mill and immediately began gouging pieces out of the turkey to put in there. She chose all the wrong bits too, the crispy ones that resisted being ground up. All the time, that damn thing was wheezing. It was like a dentist drill in each ear. My eldest was pale, and I gave her her first glass of wine and told her it was okay. We tried to ignore the spectacle as we served plates, but the thing about Aunt Carol is that if you ignore her, she just gets louder. She talked about how the mugwump didn't have a bathroom hole. Her words, not mine. And so she just put a diaper on for appearance's sake. She had to keep baby talking to it in a near shout as she shoved spoonful after spoonful of candied yams and stuffing bits down its oval mouth. I don't know if that thing had a tongue, or if it could even swallow. Half of whatever she put in it just slid out its mouth anyway. The skin at its neck kept bulging like a frog's. Aunt Amy made the mistake of looking over mid-chew and had to spit it out into her napkin. Uncle Bob, the oldest sibling, carved the turkey with murder in his eyes. When the mugwump took too much mashed potatoes and started choking, that's the point when my youngest daughter threw up. The stupid pink thing just started hacking, patches of the skin on its head pulsing in time with the coughs. My little Katie bent to the side and just unleashed a torrent from her stomach. In retrospect, I'm surprised it took that long for someone to toss it. After that, though, all bets were off. When Carol used her finger to fish a bacon bit off the mugwump's cheek and popped it into her mouth, Aunt Amy gave up and ran to the kitchen sink. Uncle Craig made it through 2 gut-churning dishes, but when Carol grabbed the giblets to put in the grinder, he darted outside. My oldest gave a wine-heavy burp. I hadn't been watching her, and she'd had 3 glasses. I used that excuse to get my family away from the table. My wife was close behind, desperately covering her mouth. The girls shared the toilet bowl. I spit a little into the sink, but managed to regain my composure. My wife said, "Fuck it," and puked in the bathtub. I think she specifically aimed for the girly soaps Aunt Carol left in the corner of the tub. We all just took a moment to breathe and concoct our excuse to get away. Because when someone like Carol is acting like that, a rational explanation like, "You and your pink tumor child are disgusting," isn't going to make an impact. When we made it back to the dining room, the only 2 people left in there were Aunt Carol and Kevin. Kevin was watching Carol coo over the food she was shoving into this thing's mouth with angry tears in his eyes.
"This is why Dad divorced you, you know,"
he said. Carol didn't react. She gasped at how clever Clarence was when he made a noise very close to a burp. We made a war party in the kitchen. We were past disgust and had arrived at anger. Fuck that thing. Fuck Caroline for that matter. We had to get her out of the house. But how? Kevin's girlfriend hit the $1 million idea. With coaching from all of us, she crept out to the dining room with a fake smile on her face.
"Hey, Carol, do you know where the whipped topping is? I've got 2 pumpkin pies ready to go out."
Carol was incensed. She slammed the spoon down.
That's absurd. There's no way 2 pumpkin pies will last this whole family.
Grumbling, she gathered her purse and ran out to the store. While she was gone, we took care of business. We got some towels to pick the mugwump up. No one wanted to touch it. And brought it to the backyard. That's when we found out that whatever a mugwump is, it's effectively immortal. Stomping on its head just led to it reinflating after a minute. Axes couldn't cut it. We even threw salt on it. To no avail. Finally, we just stuck it back in the house and burned it down. The house had been Grandpa's, but at this point, every fond memory we had built there was gone. Aunt Amy stuck a towel on the burner and turns it up to high. We put the thing on the kitchen counter and left. Carol's highly efficient shopping ways meant that she didn't get back for almost 3 hours. The firemen had to restrain her from running in after Clarence. We had already told them that Carol was crazy and there were no children left in the house. I don't know what's worse. The fact that burning down my grandfather's house was the high point of the evening, or the fact that it was only the 2nd worst Thanksgiving we'd ever had. Well, you've all heard the tale of my 2nd worst Thanksgiving. To tell you the tale of my absolute worst, you'll need to know some things. First, Aunt Amy is Uncle Bob's wife. They were together for a long time before that, but they only just married recently. The reason why? My Aunt Carol. My Uncle Bob is the oldest child in their family. It goes Bob, Carol, Uncle Craig, Uncle Tim, my mom. As such, he got held accountable for a lot more than the rest of the family. So when Bob went to his father saying he was going to ask for Amy's hand, Carol threw a fit. Why? Are you ready for this? Because as the oldest girl, she had the right to marry first, out of all the siblings. And Grandpa went with it. My grandfather was a lovely man in many ways, but his single blind spot would be the mold spore that is his oldest daughter. You know why Mom wasn't present in the last story? She hates Carol with a fiery, molten hate and takes every opportunity to ditch holidays around her. So Grandpa vetoed the proposal, and Uncle Bob waited. And waited. I would have just said fuck it and gone ahead with the marriage, but Bob was conditioned to accept his father's word as law. Finally, Carol married my cousin Kevin's father. You'd think that would be the end of it, but no. When Bob asked about money for the marriage, Carol always had some excuse. They were expanding the house. Never did. They needed emergency medical funds. Kevin was covered under his father's policy. When Bob suggested a simple courthouse wedding, Carol lit into him about the indignity of depriving his father of a real big family wedding. Well, say this much for her. Aunt Amy stuck around. She's always been an aunt everywhere except on paper, and I love her dearly. We all do. So the worst Thanksgiving happened my grandfather's last year of life. As I've said before, Bob and Amy had been doing most of my grandfather's care while Carol mostly whined about how difficult it was. She actually had the nerve to try and ban Amy from Thanksgiving, seeing as they weren't married and Amy therefore wasn't really family. Uncle Bob retrieved his balls from storage and told her that Amy had been working harder in 1 year than Carol had in her entire life, and if she so much as mentioned this again, he would kick her out. She pouted, of course. It's what she does. But Bob thought that was all. I don't think I would have made that mistake. My mom actually came to this, her father's last Thanksgiving. My dad stayed home, pled the flu. Really, he was just watching football. The lucky bastard. We all had fun saying hello to Aunt Amy, complimenting her on how hard she worked and how good the food smelled. You could practically see steam rise from Aunt Carol's scalp. She tried to steal attention by making loud, tragic announcements such as,
I just realized this may be our last Thanksgiving as a family.
We ignored her as best we could. I popped up to see my granddad. He's been a big, broad man, and the cancer had gutted him into a scarecrow. The light was gone from his eyes at this point. The machines were doing everything. I held his clammy hand in my own and tried to remember good times. Of course, Carol had to ruin it by bustling in, rearranging pillows and asking Dad a bunch of rhetorical questions. I gave it about 5 minutes before I left trembling with anger. Come to find out later that it happened to everyone. Carol butted in on their private moments with her dying father to grasp for attention. None of us suspected she might have had an ulterior motive. Well, as you can see from my last post, Carol is not much of a cook. She thinks she is. She is not. The bitch could burn water. Aunt Amy, after months of dealing with her bullshit, had become an expert Carol wrangler. Carol could manage one dish. One. It could not be oven cooked, so she wouldn't interfere with the turkey, nor was she allowed to make a dish that someone else was already bringing. Carol made a face, but obeyed. Aunt Amy, give her credit, was at least a little more suspicious of her than Bob. But the whole day was a frenzy of cooking, and so she lost track of Carol. Carol was making some sort of individualized meat pie and confiscated the turkey giblets. Bob usually uses them to make mouth-watering gravy, but let them go for the greater good. She used Pillsbury biscuit dough for the crust. How did she make meat pies when she was banned from the oven? Our dear friend the microwave. It made the house smell like dog food, a smell that makes me anxious to this day. Uncle Tim was down from the Air Force that day. He actually kicked Carol out of the room so he could have personal time with the father he hadn't seen in years. After taking his time, Tim emerged with a disturbed look on his face and held a whisper conversation with Uncle Bob. It came out later that the surgery stitches on Grandpa's chest had been disturbed. They were bleeding and bruised, like someone had reopened it and then drawn the suture back up too tightly. Bob figured Aunt Carol had messed with them for sympathy and filed it away for later, wanting to spare us the big screaming fight that would ensue. Spare us. Carol plopped a little individual pie down on every plate, not asking any of us if we even wanted one. My older girl Jill was just starting in her vegetarian kick and made a face. My little Katie almost shoved it in her mouth, but I took it away from her. Thank God. True to form, Carol had to stop the whole dinner to make a long, self-indulgent toast.
As you know, my father is reaching his last wretched moments.
Carol dabbed away a tear. Mom, who hadn't missed the possessive singular my, gripped her knife tightly.
I want everyone to know that he was a great man, that he suffered so much but always provided for his family.
The veins on Bob's neck were standing out. Aunt Amy was gripping his hand so tight her knuckles were white.
That's why I've put on this dinner tonight, so that we may give thanks for my father giving us each...
Uncle Bob broke. He pushed the chair back so hard it fell over.
Shut up. Shut the hell up about giving. You don't know a single goddamn thing about giving. Your own father is dying and you're still taking from him.
He pointed at her.
Don't deny it. Cut this bullshit about giving, Carol.
Carol was never one to realize when someone was angry with her. She drew herself up, indignant.
That's exactly what I was doing,
she said.
I was making sure to give a piece of Dad to everyone.
As one, we looked down at our meat pies.
Oh, dear God,
Aunt Amy said. The ER is crowded on holidays. Family brawls, kitchen accidents, everything terrible under the surface comes bubbling out. Getting a doctor to look at Grandpa was a nightmare, while the uncles took him to the hospital where he underwent emergency surgery. My mom and Aunt Amy took turns disposing of what we later confirmed to be pastries filled with my grandfather's tumorous flesh. Well, I'm glad everyone's enjoying stories of my dysfunctional family. It's quite cathartic to laugh at them now, even though they weren't really funny when you were living through them. To everyone asking why we didn't cut Carol off after the first incident, well, you've severely underestimated how dysfunctional my family is. Over time, we found that it was just easier to deal with Carol in person because she could throw some wicked tantrums. Case in point, when my little Jilly Bean was 6 and her sister was still just a gleam in my eye, we planned a family getaway to the beach. I invited my cousin Ellie, visiting from out of state with her kids, her brother Ty, and my cousin Kevin, who had to work. On my way to Uncle Craig's house, where we had planned to meet up, I got a text from Kevin that I didn't read until I was pulling into the driveway. Kevin.
I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. I don't know how she found out.
At that exact moment, Carol stepped out of the house in a robe and a big floppy sun hat.
There you are, dear. You can help me load my bag on the luggage rack,
she said, which is how I found out she was expected to come with us. Just like that. No invitation. No one even told her we were going. I coolly explained to her that there was only enough room in 2 cars for the people we had invited out, but logic bounces off her head like a bird flying into a window. She said I could just drive and hold Jill on my lap. That's how they did it back in the day. I said that was unsafe. She said it was fine. I said it wasn't fine. She told me not to be difficult. Finally, I snapped and told her she wasn't invited, wasn't wanted, and could fuck off for all I cared. She made what is colloquially known as a cat butt face, but didn't throw the loud tantrum I'd been fearing. No. What she did was much worse. Taya and I decided to get some last-minute sunblock and took Ellie's husband along to show him around. When we got back, I was pulled from the car and handcuffed on the hood while my terrified daughter watched. Carol told the cops I was a drug addict who had stolen her niece, that the other 2 men in the car were my accomplices. Well, that was sorted out. It took hours. Carol took Jill for a ride in her car and told her all about how she'd be living with Carol now, that her daddy was in jail and her mommy was going to leave because of that. Jill was crying to the point of hyperventilating when they pulled back into the driveway and met my wife, who Kevin had summoned knowing his mother's tendency for bullshit. I don't know what kept my wife from murdering Carol right then and there, but she grabbed Jill and went to work getting us free. When I got out, I just hugged the both of them, kissing them over and over and promising Jill she'd never have to live without Carol, ever. And Carol didn't see that she did anything wrong. I mean, you've seen how she reacts to things. She genuinely thought she deserved to go with us, and that making a false police report was a proportionate reaction. What can you even do with someone like that? Grandpa, still kicking at this time, apologized to me for Carol's behavior, but told me to forgive my aunt in the interest of family. But enough about that. You want to hear how we got rid of her, don't you? Well, you can tell from these stories and my use of present tense that Carol is still alive. We, as a family, hope so, at least. To start things off, Uncle Bob and Aunt Amy got married. It was a blast. Bob wore sunglasses. We did the hustle. The reception was shoes optional. Carol just sat seething through the whole thing because she couldn't successfully steal attention in such a big shindig. She tried her best, though. She wore a white dress to a wedding and had numerous fake fainting spells. Tragically, she had no date and no mugwump to feed. Well, the wedding could have gone on for days, but it wrapped up at 11. We were all staying at this B&B in town, and as such decided to carpool because there weren't enough designated drivers to go around. I plopped into the front seat. My wife piled into the back with my girls. We were merry with good food and drink, and Carol opened the driver's side door. Few things will sober your ass up faster than fear. Carol was a terrible driver, to the point where she had no longer had a license. Well, the drink slowed my response times, and I was unable to snatch the keys from the ignition before Carol shut the door and started the car.
Ugh, glad that's over.
Carol rolled her eyes and screeched into reverse. I winced as I heard the crunch of my tail light hitting someone's back bumper. My wife squeezed our girls in the back seat, all huddled together like frightened rabbits. The thing about being in a dysfunctional family is that it messes with your reactions. A normal person might respond to someone just getting into their car and driving off by saying, "Pull over, or I'll call the cops and tell them you're abducting us." We stayed quiet, hoping Carol would just take us to the B&B without too many incidents. I was in no state to drive anyway, and it was such a short way. How much damage could she do? God, the mental gymnastics I went through. Well, we missed the first turnoff to the town. Katie piped up.
Auntie Carol, we were supposed to turn back there.
Hush, sweetie, don't talk. It distracts the driver.
I let that one go. There was another turnoff coming up. She could make that one. All right, just up here. You see that sign? We turn here. You see that sign? You see that? She cruised right by it, squinting.
What sign?
I gave a growl of frustration. My wife's face was white in the rearview mirror. Carol, stop the car. I want to get out.
Nonsense, dear. We're in the middle of the country. No reason you should have to walk.
Carol drove on. The road was dark because there were no streetlights out here in the countryside. I thought of so many things. Engaging the e-brake, grabbing the wheel, but I wasn't alone in the car and was afraid of what a panicked Carol could do to my family.
Oh, there it is.
There was a turnoff coming up, almost invisible from the amount of overgrown weeds. Carol put on her signal. Carol, this isn't the bed and breakfast.
Of course it is, dear.
Carol turned too fast, making my stomach lurch.
I was just here this afternoon.
You'd think a minute into our drive up the long, winding path would clue her into the fact that this was not the restored colonial building that sat on a busy street between an antique shop and a wine bar. But no. The driveway finally ended at a large white house that had bad news written all over it. The windows had sheets tacked over them on the outside. The yard was so overgrown Katie could have walked into it and disappeared. There were men, silent, staring men in white clothes that walked up as the car rolled to a stop. You'd think that Carol, squinting over the dash, would finally realize that this was not our destination. Instead, she turned off the car, took the keys from the ignition, and opened the door.
Excuse me, which one of you is the valet?
A man stepped forward, hand out. Carol, God damn it, no! Before I could even get my seatbelt off, she handed the keys off to this gentleman in white. Someone opened my door. The men were at the front and back doors gesturing for us to come out. Katie was wide-eyed with fear. Jill looked like she'd bite the first hand that came near her. Well, I decided I wasn't getting my keys back, just sitting in the car, and got out. The men were looking at Carol's white dress.
What a lovely thing,
one said. Carol, whose biggest weakness was vanity, blushed.
Aren't you nice young men?
Carol? I tried to keep my voice steady. This isn't our hotel. I want the keys back, and then we can drive out of here and pretend we never saw any of you. No harm, no foul.
Oh, pooh. You don't know how to be nice.
She turned to the men. I'm
so sorry for my nephew's manners. Do you have any coffee?
My girls pressed into my back. My wife had her arm tightly around me, ready to go down swinging. The man who took our keys tilted his head. Then he turned and started walking to the house. No! I pressed forward as much as I dared. She doesn't speak for my family. I do. Give me those goddamn car keys and let us go. The man didn't move. Carol smirked at me.
You see what being rude gets you? Lila raised you with no manners at all.
She tossed her head and walked after the man. So, picture this. It's dark, in the middle of fuck knows where. I've got no car keys and my family clinging to my back. We're surrounded by a bunch of creepy, no-expression dudes dressed entirely in white. What the hell do you do? Well, when you figure it out, go back in time and tell me. I was a complete blank. All we did was sit there and shiver until the men started moving. They bunched up behind us until I felt compelled to walk forward. One of them drew up beside Katie.
I'll take that,
he said, reaching for her hand. Katie screamed and flinched back. Jill bared her teeth and pulled Katie further into her. The man looked down at Jill's plum-colored dress.
That is not a pure color.
I let that go without comment. I was coiling up for a big strike, ready to cave someone's head in. The man looked up at me.
Is she not pure?
It took a minute for the phrase to trickle in. Is she... Are you asking if she's a virgin? Yes. We were being led out to the yard. There were large hedges, styled into weird abstract shapes. White sheets fluttered between them.
No,
Jill said.
I fucked tons of guys and girls.
And the little one?
Rather than deck him for implying my youngest daughter was a slut, I shook my head. Katie trembled in her pretty pink dress.
And her?
My wife laughed out loud.
Take a guess for that one, Sherlock.
The men stopped. It was very unnerving. They were completely silent. The only sound in that yard was our frightened breath and the wind flapping through the sheets. Through the leaves of one hedge, I saw a branch so smooth and pale it looked like an arm.
Then the woman, Carol, she is the only one?
Sure, I snapped. The man who had been speaking nodded. We were grabbed from all directions all at once. The girls screamed.
Then you must come with us until we can persuade you to part with her.
Wait! I screamed. Wait, wait, wait. You can have her. The men paused. Katie was sobbing. Jill was twisting in their grip. So was my wife. I'll give you Carol, I said. And all it will cost you is my car keys. The men turned as one to the house, like they were listening. Finally, one of them said,
It is good.
As we were escorted out, I saw one of the hedges swaying in the breeze. At least I think there was a breeze. One of the men met us at the car, keys in his palm. I swiped them before they had a chance to change their mind. It's a funny thing, Terror. My family just shuffled into the car like we were leaving church. I think we were all kind of numb from shock as the car bounced down the long, winding road. It wasn't until we hit the road again that I woke up, stepping on the gas so that the tires screeched. I drove with one hand on the wheel, the other holding my wife's as we pulled into town. The girls looked shell-shocked. When we finally parked and got out, I gave each of them a nice long hug. We couldn't sleep properly, so we piled onto the suite's bed, the girls sandwiched between us, and sat up talking. It's very telling that no one missed Carol until weeks after the wedding. Kevin called us up, said,
Hey, it's Kevin. I got a notice from my mum's kennel service. Her Yorkie had only been paid through 2 weeks, and now they want more money.
Carol was first and foremost a dog lover, so this was actually out of character for her. No one at the wedding knew where Carol had gone. She wasn't actually on the designated driver's list. I guess getting into our car was just a whim. That or Kevin's girlfriend had kicked her out for one too many passive-aggressive jabs, and no one had paid much attention to her after the reception. We had come in kind of late. Had we dropped her off? I maintained eye contact with my wife and spoke calmly and slowly. I had gotten us lost after recklessly deciding to drive tipsy. I hadn't seen Carol. None of us had. My wife gave me a small, approving nod. They never found Carol, but they never looked very hard for her either. The family healed over it, like a tree heals around a chopped-off branch. And Carol? Yeah, I hope she's still alive. I hope those spooky assholes never figured out that she wasn't pure. That she was just vain enough to deny it. I hope she lives a long, full life with both feet planted firmly in the ground. Well, just because Carol's with her nice friends in white doesn't mean I've run out of stories for you. Today's tale comes from my mother, who hated Carol possibly more than anyone in the family. See, Carol had already sucked all the air out of the house by the time my mom was born. I think it was a combination of Grandpa's old school leanings and the fact that there was no other female in the family until my mom was born. From what I hear, Grandma just kind of stewed in depression most of their lives. Carol was given free run of the house, which probably set the precedent early on. After Grandma died, Carol would forcibly try to mother her family, and by family, I mean my mom. Carol not having a maternal bone in her body meant that it was mostly just controlling behavior, holding her to some bizarre standard of what a lady did. A standard that did not apply to Carol, mind you. All this culminated in the event that led to my mother moving out before she'd even finished high school. Grandpa never stopped her, and gave her some money because he felt guilty about not being there for her more. Money that Carol immediately called and tried to get it back. High school prom. My mom had a dress that looked like an organza wedding cake. Her hair was crimped. Her eyeshadow was powder blue. She was ready. Except she needed an escort. An escort like she was a debutante going to a royal ball. And who to escort her? Why, her older sister, of course. My mom is a fighter. She fought. She physically fought. Uncle Bob is the only reason Carol has 2 eyes left in her head. My mom was going for broke. Finally, he was able to talk her down from her blind rage by begging her to do this for Dad. Mom finally relented that Carol could come, but she would have none of the privileges she'd been demanding. No veto power over her dates. No helping Mom with her hair. No coming into the prom itself. Not that that stopped Carol from trying to interfere. She took a bunch of jabs at my mom's dates. The guy had terrible hair. He was a nerd. His family was poor. He wasn't good enough for Mom. Yada, yada. Well, not to get too corny, but that nerd is my father. So my mom won on that count. Well, no one was having something Carol couldn't have, so she needed a date too. Said date was a complete mystery until the night of the prom, so Mom just figured she had made someone up out of jealousy and was planning to throw a fit when he didn't show. Oh, how wrong she was. My nerd father showed up in his dad's ill-fitting tux with the corsage he made out of origami. Supposedly having a date didn't stop Aunt Carol from hitting on him. My dad gets the cold horrors to this day when reminded about it. Carol was bizarrely inappropriate, accidentally brushing against his naughty bits and making comments about preferring mature women. You'd think my mom would be furious, but Actually, she was fighting really hard to hold in her laughter. She wasn't laughing when Carol's date showed up. To get you ready for this hunk of manhood, I'll inform you that he introduced himself as Slim. We have no idea where Carol found this guy. Carol was like a dowsing rod for the bazaar, as you've seen. He was clearly in his 40s, leather fringe vest, Hulk Hogan mustache, cheap tats, and one white, milky eye. I wouldn't have believed my mom about this walking, talking stereotype, but she showed me the picture Uncle Tim snapped at Carol's insistence. My dad has a deer in the headlights look. My mom looks both distressed and angry, and Slim towers over Carol, who is doing this faux demure smile. Carol has some really old-fashioned ideas of men and women, like medieval old. It was best when the man was older than the woman and ordered her around. Men should pay for everything, yet Slim kept bumming money off of her and my mom. Wrap your head around that one. Women couldn't so much as burp without apologizing a million times, but men could be as raunchy as they wanted because that's just how it is. Men could never control their urges, so being alone with a man was an open invitation. And of course, her all-important edict against being rude. Mom couldn't refuse to let a 40-something stranger on her prom date. It would be rude. She couldn't turn down his chivalrous offer to sit in the back seat with him. Dad fell on that grenade and said he got carsick riding shotgun, so Mom got to ride up front. No asking Slim about his eye, his employment status, or who the hell he was. Personal questions were the rudest of all, don't you know? So my mom had two choices. One was to stay at home, miss prom, and probably still have to deal with Slim. The other was to brave the car ride, go to prom, and possibly ditch Carol. She went with door number 2. Slim spent the whole ride making gross jokes about high school girls. Carol spent it drilling my dad for info. I think she still had her heart on stealing my dad from her sister, and Dad was not used to her brand of crazy, so he was differentially polite. My mom was heartbroken by the time they actually got into the school. She thought Dad had been put off by her crazy family. She said when they got their tickets, they had a moment where they each looked at each other and just laughed. Then they went to drink punch and dance. I'm happy to say that portion of the night went well for them. They had a real connection, otherwise I wouldn't be here, would I? And enjoyed bonding over how crazy Carol was. Sadly, that good portion ended when my mom couldn't find her bladder anymore and went to the ladies' room. Carol came in, blatantly breaking rule number 3, calling Mom's name. My mom contemplated just not answering her for a minute before responding. Carol said her little prom date was waiting for her by the rear entrance. She shouldn't be rude and keep him waiting. Mom thought it was weird my dad would be out there, which is where people ducked out to smoke, but okay. He probably wanted to ditch the prom and Carol. There were no lights back there, so my mom was waiting for her eyes to adjust as the one-way door closed behind her. When her night vision kicked in, she saw not the dorky silhouette of my father, but the glow of a cigarette reflected in one milky eye. Around this time, Carol approached my dad, who was waiting with 2 slices of cake like the gentleman he was. After some nauseating flirtation, Carol said that my mom had ditched him for some other guy. She was so sorry and would he like to dance? My dad knew exactly 2 things in that moment. One was that he didn't and would never trust Carol. The other was that wherever my mom was, she was probably in peril. So that nerd turned his back on Carol and summoned his nerd pack to spread out and search for her. My mom, meantime, was waffling between fight and flight. Slim stood in the middle of her escape route, and she was in heels for the first time in her life. Slim killed a cigarette.
Your sister wants to go now.
That's not what she told me. She said my date was looking for me.
Slim laughed.
We ought to go anyway. Getting close to your bedtime, little girl.
Slim picked up a cup he'd had sitting on the ground next to him.
Here, finish your punch and we'll go.
My grandpa, being old-fashioned, had not educated my mother in the finer points of date rape. My mother smelled the punch for liquor and found none, so she took a drink. She hoped it would put Slim off his guard. Maybe she could charge past him for freedom. Screaming for help never occurred to her, because good old Grandpa had ingrained in her the need to never make a fuss about anything. Mom said when her legs started to go, that was the scariest moment of her life. Slim had watched her drink. Now he held his arms out like he was going to catch her. One of Dad's friends, acting on a whim, pushed open the back door. Mom flopped over to him, fighting her suddenly clumsy tongue to beg him to bring her inside. Dad said his friend took one look at Slim and knew the score.
Hold on now, I'm her uncle.
Slim was walking to them with his hand out.
It's alright.
Dad's friend grabbed my mom under the armpits and yanked her back inside. Well, in my mom's impaired state, she realized she had been poisoned, and the best way to get it out would be to vomit. So she had him drag her into the bathroom where she was in good hurling company. My dad, having heard through the grapevine what was going on, went into the bathroom and held Mom's hair while she tossed it. That's when she knew he was a keeper. Dad and his friends took charge of my mom that night, whisking her away to an all-night diner and giving her lots of coffee until she could talk without slurring. Then she slept on the floor of his den in the middle of a protective nerd field. Never felt so loved, she said. In the morning, Dad's mom made her eggs and waffles and gave her a nice hug. All the good feelings of that morning promptly dissipated when she arrived home and saw Carol waiting at the front door with her arms crossed, radiating disapproval. How dare she ditch her chaperone? How dare she be so rude to Slim, who disappeared, probably due to her rudeness? How dare she spend the night at a boy's like a common slut? Mom stepped out of her heels, walked up to the porch, and calmly punched Carol right the fuck out. Then she turned around, got back in the car, and went to live with my father's family. Uncle Bob was responsible for getting my mom's stuff to her. Even so, quite a few of her clothes disappeared before they could be accounted for, along with some of her jewelry and the pillow Grandma had sewn for her. Mom ate the loss because it was a small price to pay for her freedom. My dad's family were lovely people who helped them out a lot, and so my mother had a non-dysfunctional family to model after when I came along. And Slim? Why, he was the best man at their wedding. I kid. He kept showing up to the school and then the waitress job my mom got. So my dad's dad threatened him with the cops if he didn't cut the shit. He would still pop up from time to time, shooting her a wink with that milky eye from across the grocery store or on the street. Every time she was tempted to forgive Carol, Mom said, that guy would remind her why she shouldn't. Today I'd like to tell you about Aunt Carol's divorce. Kevin was a little over 8 when she split from her husband Leland, and instead of celebrating sweet, sweet freedom, he went through unimaginable torment via his mother. So with all I've said about Carol, you'd probably think her husband Leland was a better person. You'd be wrong. Carol would only ever have married 2 kinds of people: a deaf, blind, bedbound saint with a bottomless bank account, or someone as scummy as her. Leland was the second. Wasn't much of a dad, wasn't much of a husband. His only saving grace was his mother, who did the bulk of Kevin's care. He was rich, so none of us thought Carol would ever leave him. We underestimated her. Carol randomly decided one day that Leland wasn't deferential enough to her and threatened divorce. This was on his office phone in the middle of the day. By the time he got home that night, Leland had divorce papers to throw on the coffee table right in front of her. Carol tried backpedaling, offering counseling or a second honeymoon instead, but I guess even guys like Leland get tired of throwing money down the black pit that is Aunt Carol, so he pressed for a separation. Leland brought a lot of assets to the marriage. He had money, property, stock options, the works. Carol had exactly one asset. And no, I'm not talking about her crazy. Kevin. I've said before Carol wasn't much of a mother. Well, as soon as it looked like she might not have her son anymore, Carol decided she wanted him. Unfortunately for her, Kevin was with his grandmother that day. Carol showed up and demanded her son. They were moving to Mexico right this minute. And yes, that's exactly what she said to Kevin's grandmother. She was actually dumbfounded when the old woman slammed the door in her face. Of course it didn't end there. This is Carol we're talking about here. Leland decided to keep Kevin around. Not to protect him from Carol, oh no, but because he wanted to establish residency prior to the custody hearing so he wouldn't have to give his wife so much money. While Carol dropped off the radar for a while, Leland kept Kevin under tight surveillance, which is why it came as such a shock when Kevin was kidnapped from school right in broad daylight. Kevin was under strict orders to wait for his grandmother's car before he even thought about stepping outside. He was walking across the schoolyard, maybe 50 feet from her car, when some random burly dude ran past and scooped him up. They got into a blue van with taped up plates that was idling at the corner with its side door already open. The whole thing from grab to getaway lasted about 15 seconds. Totally planned. Kevin's grandmother made a police report, but without the license plate there wasn't a whole lot to go on. That's where our family comes in. You may have noticed this from previous stories, but there's a real strong deal with it yourself mentality running through us. Sometimes it's harmful, like when you've decided to euthanize a mugwump, but sometimes it's good, like in this instance. Uncle Bob couldn't just let his nephew disappear without doing anything, so he enlisted Uncle Craig and my dad to drive over and grill Granny for details. The old lady was taken aback at how not crazy they were compared to Carol, and gave them all the info she could remember. Bob got the idea to drive around just to see if anything matched that description. Well, he must have pleased some deity that day, because they spotted a blue van outside this car shop. They weren't sure if it was the right one until a guy came out, toweling the grease off his hands. Granny confirmed it was the kidnapper. After they dropped her off back home, they went back to the shop to confront the guy. My dad said it was his idea to ask the guy about getting a quote that got him close enough to the car that my uncles could jump in. They grabbed either arm and slammed him up against the car, screaming about their nephew. At the first question about Kevin, the guy blew up. They could all fuck off or he'd call the cops. Drug dealer thugs weren't about to intimidate him. Ah, yes. That old chestnut. Bob said they were not drug dealers. They were the kid's uncles, and if he didn't fess up, he would be eating his own teeth. I can imagine the guy's face in that moment, when that light switch first flipped. They were not drug dealers? No. They were not sent to kidnap Carol and bury her in a shallow grave. The only one who wanted to see Carol at that point was a divorce lawyer. Dad said the guy just got pale and started babbling. Carol had told him that her ex-con hubby had gotten out of prison and wanted to take the son that she had raised by herself, just so he could use him to run drugs. I think they didn't report the guy to the cops because they felt sorry for him. Carol had fed him this long line of bullshit, and he'd scarfed it down like a Thanksgiving turkey. Dad promised not to turn him in if he just told them where he brought the kid, The guy stammered that he dropped him off in an empty field outside of town. Carol hadn't been there, but a withered old guy in camo gear was. As per Carol's instructions, he gave Kevin over to the old man. The guy apologized. He hadn't wanted to do it. Kevin was a nice kid and had actually talked to his captors like they were human beings, but Carol had promised she'd be along shortly to take Kevin with her. Of course, that never happened. Bob told Leland about the field. Leland got the cops to organize a search party. The field turned up completely empty, not even a breadcrumb to be found. Uncle Craig speculated that she'd given Kevin to some crazy survivalist and he probably knew how to hide someone away really well. Of course, the person who could have enlightened everyone, Carol, was nowhere to be found until she called Leland and requested a custody meeting. Anyone else, in any other family, would have been met with cuffs as soon as she walked in the door, but a combination of Leland's apathy and my family's closed-offness meant that the only ones in the room that day were Carol, Leland, and Leland's lawyer. Carol was smirking when she came in. Leland's lawyer, former lawyer I should say, told me that she didn't even look mildly upset about her son. She wanted to talk terms first. Leland said, "Okay, sure. You can have this much alimony." He probably lowballed her, but Carol snapped up the amount. And Kevin would see her. No, Carol cut in. She got Kevin. She got full custody and the money. At this point, both men were gaping at her, and Carol just sat there smirking. Did Carol know anything about her son's whereabouts? Smirk. Shrug. Because if she did, and didn't turn it over, she would be legally barred from custody. Well, then maybe Kevin would just stay lost then, wouldn't he? The lawyer said he had never seen anything like it in all his years of mediation. A woman so emotionally removed from her offspring that she would abandon him to a stranger out of greed. Leland caved. It wasn't the money, really, or his son. He just couldn't stand Carol getting so much over on him. Carol smiled and took the terms, saying she'd be in touch. And right as she stepped out of the office, she was confronted by her brothers and brother-in-law. They were picking up Kevin right now. Carol frowned for the first time that day. Couldn't wait. She had an appointment. Bob got right in her face and told her if they didn't get Kevin, he would tell Dad she sold her own son. Carol whined against it, but they physically pulled her into the car and went driving. They went to that field. When asked how they'd get Kevin back, Carol smirked. Who knew where he was? Maybe they'd look and get lucky. Dad said he had to try very hard not to hit her then. Carol got out of the car and walked off into the field. Dad said they tried to watch where she went, but somehow she just vanished and she walked away. They waited for a half an hour. Finally, when they were contemplating sending one of them back in the car to get cops, Carol came out of the field from a completely different direction than the one she'd been traveling, walking like she was casually strolling to the store. Completely alone. Dad said she opened the passenger door, offhandedly said that they'd probably want to look in that part of the field, and then got in. The men spread out and searched the field. They found Kevin laying on a tarp in the middle of a stand of mullein. The poor kid was shirtless and shivering. He had tree branches strapped to his hands and feet, and 3 lines of deer blood painted down his face. Dad said when they reached him, Kevin flinched back like he didn't even know who they were. Bob took his coat off and wrapped him in it, then picked Kevin up. Carol was right in the car where they'd left her, looking irked at the wait. They could just drop her off at the law offices, then she could pick her car up. No, my dad said. Kevin needed to go to the hospital. Carol made her patented cat butt face, but she was late. Kevin could sleep it off at home. Bob said Kevin was staying with them that night, and possibly indefinitely. Carol got a sly look and said he'd probably get lost again if he didn't live with her. She had custody, She had rights. The men exchanged a look. Literally the last thing this kid needed was to stay with Carol. But, well, she had them between a rock and a hard place. No one knew better than them how badly Carol could fuck up their lives. They were not going to win this battle, but they might win the war. They argued her down to dropping her off to get her car while they took Kevin to the hospital. They checked him for all the usual things, even sexual assault, which came up negative, thank God. Kevin was slightly malnourished and had suffered from exposure at one point. In addition to the deer blood on his face, fat mixed with ash had been smeared on his body in a few places. The reason he hadn't talked to any of them so far was discovered when they opened his mouth and found a series of knife cuts on his tongue. Once they made sure that Kevin was mostly okay, they made the long drive back to Carol's. The whole time, Bob kept apologizing to Kevin for making him go back to his mother, telling him he could call anyone in the family at any time for help. My dad said his heart broke when Kevin went up that walk, and Carol just yelled for him to come in. She didn't want to get up and open the door. Carol was floating on clouds of smug. She had her money. She had her son. She had everything. Until about 2 months later, when she got bored and dropped Kevin off with his grandmother again. Granny could have called the cops, raised a stink, but I think she knew in her heart that it would only end badly. Carol kept getting louder. Child support. And Kevin ended up in a mostly stable household. It was a win-win all around. I was only a kid when this happened, so most of this is secondhand. Kevin never talked about what happened to him during that time, where he was. Whenever someone asked him about it, he just froze up with a terrified look on his face. So we stopped asking. To be honest, I would have embraced the chance to have nothing to do with my mother after a fiasco like that. But Kevin's been reeling in the wake of Carol's disappearance, kind of seesawing between grief and anger. I think the poor guy misses the relationship he should have had with his mother, rather than the woman herself. As for me, I say ding dong, the witch is gone. First off, the title is a bit misleading. Carol ruined every fucking Christmas she was a part of. Whether it was accidentally spilling scalding hot coffee into my wife's lap so we spent the rest of the day in the ER, or setting the goddamn tree on actual fire. The woman had a talent for it. But this was the first Christmas where her evil just permeated the entire day, so that we couldn't get one enjoyable memory out of it. The ruined Christmas was the first holiday I brought my girlfriend, now wife, Sarah, to meet everyone. She had already met my parents and my dad's parents. Now she was ready for the other half. I warned her. I told her going in that it was crazy. Not ha ha ha, we were so quirky, kooky, and zany crazy, but homeless dude disemboweling squirrels to wear them as socks crazy. She didn't believe me. Well, we got there. We went through the rounds of coat taking and cheek kissing, and everything seemed pretty normal. They seemed to like my girlfriend, and she liked them. Our first taste of Carol was when she tottered over, all fake nice, and cozying up to my girlfriend like they were old friends. She promptly ruined it by making a racist comment. She assumed Sarah was Puerto Rican. She very clearly isn't. And then stepping on Sarah's little toe when she went for a hug. Sarah gave me a look when they disengaged. I lifted my eyebrows at her. It wasn't even the tip of the crazy iceberg. I can tell you what Carol does, but that doesn't get across the utter hell of just being around Carol. Having her butt into several conversations at once, demanding hugs so she can leave white shoulders on your clothes that won't come off after 50 washes, making backhanded compliments, giving unwanted advice, invading your personal space, poking, pinching, prodding every inch of unprotected skin until you want to backhand her. 1,001 little things that built up like midge bites. Sarah doesn't have the most functional of families, but she was still shooting me astonished looks throughout the night. She was about ready to strangle Carol when the gift-giving finally started. Let me tell you something about Carol and presents. Carol likes to get and doesn't really care for the give part. Big shocker, I know. So we would give her the tacky, glittery baubles we knew she would like, and she would give us any old thing she picked up. I swear to God, that is the literal truth. She gave us a towel she found on the road one year. I know this because I saw it on her drive up. For some reason, this year she decided to give us actual gifty things. They were all more effort than her usual presents, but the effort was grossly misapplied. Aunt Amy got a saddle intact when she has never owned a horse or ridden one. My girlfriend got expensive weight loss stuff. Carol had never met my girlfriend prior to this, nor did she need to lose weight. Kevin got a shirt many sizes too large for him, which didn't matter because it was missing all its buttons. My mom got this antique silver brush set with rotting bristles. Bob got his own toolbox. As in, she gave him his own toolbox after taking it at some unspecified point in the past. It even had his initials scratched in the lid. And Uncle Tim? I don't know how much of Carol's actions are calculated malice and how much are just plain stupidity. Either way, when Tim unwrapped a lovely picture frame bearing a photo of him and the wife that had left him not 2 months prior, it came to the same result. Tim is not the easiest guy to get along with, but he really loved his wife. He just looked crushed when he unwrapped it, while Carol chirped on about how expensive the frame was. He excused himself out to the car, and then we had to pretend we didn't hear him crying for the next 20 minutes. Oh. But the capper to the evening was Uncle Craig's present. Carol had parked around the corner from the house and was acting all sneaky about it. Right in the middle of gift giving, she makes a big announcement that we all had to go outside right now. We took our mugs of eggnog and prepared for letdown. Instead, we came face to face with a boat hitched up behind Carol's car. We were expecting her to brag about how it was a Christmas present to herself, but to our shock, she up and handed the keys to Uncle Craig. She bought him a boat? Craig had this look on his face like he couldn't quite figure it out. He hadn't helped Carol out at all that year. What was the occasion? Maybe she had just bought a boat on a whim, decided she didn't want it, and gave it to the sibling that had earned the least wrath over the past year. I can see you right now. You're looking at the computer screen and shaking your head. That's the proper response. Well, Carol only stuck around a little while after that. I think she was expecting a bigger response from all of us, but we were way too wise to assume she was doing it out of the goodness of her heart. She made some comment about picking up more coffee and left and didn't come back. We were cautious cheerful. Only half a day with Carol. It really was Christmas. Close to dark, Uncle Bob looked outside and saw a handful of guys on Uncle Craig's boat. They were standing on the bumper, patting the keel, touching it all over. He wanted to call the cops, but no. Tim had something to prove after that afternoon, and went outside to confront them. A little while later, he came back in, white-faced, and told us to lock the doors and not even look outside. There was a terrible smell that rolled in with him, a combination of rotting citrus and bad meat, and it permeated everything until we couldn't even smell dinner in the oven. We tried to soldier on through it, but there was just no way. After night fell, and the guys and the boat seemed to have vanished, we decided to go out to a restaurant. We came back to the front door hanging open and all the presents missing. Well, I turned to Sarah and said, "I told you. Crazy, right?" She laughed instead of crying, and we're still together almost 20 years later. That would be a cute little end to the story. Only I got a chance to ask Uncle Tim about what happened in the yard. The guy was a little into his cups when I did this, so he was a lot freer with the information that he might normally be. He said he went out to confront the guys, shouting to them that they were on private property. The guys just looked at him. They all looked pretty tough, like they could go from talking to fighting in a second. Tim was pretty hot-blooded, but something about their tense silence made him try diplomacy first. Tim said that this was his brother's boat. The guys said, No, it's their friend's boat. Whoever had sold it to him had clearly been a criminal. Tim said he didn't buy it. His sister did. And she hadn't mentioned the buyer. The guys took a huddle, whispering really harshly in a language Tim couldn't quite place, and then turned around to face Tim again. What he got out of them is this. They had a friend. Friend got into, not elaborated on, trouble and picked up house and ran. Took his wife with him and set sail for the tropics. His boat wound up adrift in a marina miles away from his last reported whereabouts. Tim said that was quite a story, but what the hell did they want? They asked him to wait a minute. They searched over every inch of that boat. They patted every surface and fished a penknife into every crack. Finally, one of them found a panel that they pried open with a knife. Tim said the smell rolling out of that space made him want to vomit, but the men stayed stoic like it wasn't even there. The compartment held this fish, about 5 feet long, looked a bit like a lionfish, but blue. Tim said they didn't even pause. They pulled that sucker out and took turns kicking it in the stomach. Finally, after one of them stomped on it, the lips opened and vomited out a human hand. One of the guys bent down and, without hesitating even a second, started sucking on the fingers. Tim said that's when he went back inside. Screw the boat. Craig wasn't really attached to it anyway. He knew he was dealing with shit well above his pay grade. He theorized that some of the things Carol had given us had been on the boat, and that they had stolen all of the presents because they weren't sure which ones. I think he knew more about the guys than he let on, but I left it there. So Carol didn't give us all tumor pies or make us watch her feed the horrible things she found by the side of the road, but she managed to ruin a holiday just by being her. What kills me about this is, in her mind, it was a genuine attempt at being generous. So, even when she wasn't intentionally being evil, she was still evil. Yes, plural. Kids. She's done it more than once and always managed to wriggle out of it like the hagfish she is. I'm only telling you about 3 of them today because these are the ones I have the most information on. I'll start with my friend Trish's tale because it's the least terrible. I had told Trish about my crazy aunt and she'd kinda laughed it off. No one could be that extreme, right? Trish is a photographer's assistant and she was helping out at an Easter celebration at a church the day she finally saw my aunt in the flesh. I don't know how anyone can come face to face with Carol and ignore the stench of brimstone clogging their nostrils, but Trish just saw her as a normal, if weird, older woman at first. It was only later that she connected the dots. Carol had the hand of a little girl who was tugging away, saying stuff like,
"But I don't want to. Let me go."
Carol dragged the little girl over to Trish.
"Can we get a photo now? I'm sure nobody will mind if you let me go first."
Trish stammered,
Actually, we were working on a ticket system, so you go in the order of the number on your stub. Maybe you and your daughter can talk it over with someone who has a closer number.
The little girl said.
She's not my mom. I don't know her.
Carol always wanted a little girl. Scratch that. She wanted a mini-me with no thoughts or opinions to show off how great she is. Kevin was an eternal disappointment to her, so rather than go through childbirth again, she would co-opt other people's children. She tried to come after my little Jillian, as demonstrated by her fun little car ride, but my wife and I put a stop to that pretty quick. Trish, possessing none of this vital information, froze. There was no training for this sort of situation, and her brain kind of skipped a beat.
You're not her mother?
Carol let out one of her patented fake laughs.
Of course not. But we're just so photogenic together, don't you think?
The little girl looked nothing like Carol, in that she was actually not a butter troll. Carol posed next to her like they were going to be in a magazine spread. The little girl just looked irritated and bored. Luckily, Trish was saved from having to make a hard decision by the girl's mother running up.
Jessica, I've been looking for you everywhere.
Carol dropped her hand and pouted. The girl's mother, I own Carol, escorted her away while holding a whisper conversation. The family only knew Carol as a fellow congregant, and not very well at that. Word spread and everyone started avoiding her. This only sped up Carol's usual cycle of join, infiltrate, abandon that she went through with each new church. When Trish told me the story, I'll admit, I laughed a little bit. This was quite possibly the best case scenario with Carol. She didn't get a chance to do something criminally neglectful. Yet. The second incident was put together through Uncle Craig after the fact. As it happened, there was a family at a mall. The mom wanted to go in a store. The two kids didn't. Mom sat younger kid down on a bench, told older kid to watch him just a second, and went in. Carol came strolling along. You could even see her purse her mouth as she used that stupid baby voice she thinks little kids love. She asked the little kid if he was left all by himself. Older kid butted in that no, there were two of them. Younger kid didn't answer. Carol asked him if he wants anything. The younger kid said he needs to go potty. The older kid said no, their mom will be out in a minute. Carol put her hand out to the kid and insisted she take him to potty. The older kid says no, she can't. Younger kid, taught to obey adults over siblings, hopped off the bench. Older kid ran inside to get mother. Carol walked off with younger kid. Of course, they didn't go right to the bathrooms. They stopped off at toy stores and seized candy, because Carol is a massive tease that likes to psych kids up so she can more effectively disappoint them. Meanwhile, kid's mother was going apeshit. I admit, making your kid watch your other kid in a crowded mall is not the wisest parenting decision, but that woman in no way deserved to have to deal with Carol. Security caught up with Carol around Sports Authority. No one had looked twice at a cranky kid trying to wrench away from an older woman. When the guard came up and demanded she turn over the kid, Carol burst into tears. She was only gone a little while. She was going to bring him right back. This was so rude. Like an octopus shoots ink to escape predators, Carol leaves a cloud of befuddlement in her wake. Somehow, the guy ended up letting Carol off with a warning, which hopefully earned him a dope slap from the firm that employed him. It fell to Uncle Craig to sort everything out because he was home when she called. I don't know. There's a lot of sunk cost fallacy when it comes to Carol's siblings. I think one of the reasons Carol didn't go to jail was that the mother was considered also at fault for leaving her kids alone in a crowded mall. And then there's the time she abandoned me. Carol is not a mother, as I've stated, but she makes a point of trying to mother other people's kids. She was always correcting my mom about the way she was raising me, and the corrections were anything but correct. My mom tried to prepare me against her crazy just in case she tried to give me whiskey for a toothache or something like that when she wasn't around, but I don't think any amount of preparation would have prevented this. For good reason. Mom hated Carol, so she made sure to drop me off at Grandpa's when Carol wasn't there. You know, I just can't do justice as to how cool Grandpa was. He handmade wooden toys every Christmas. He had the coolest house full of neat junk and just loved his children and grandchildren to bits. It's just that one of those children happened to be Carol, and Carol happened to drop by an hour after my mother left to run errands. I was building a train track with Grandpa when Carol came in, all fake sweetness and love bombing. I think kids have an innate sense of when someone is pretending to be nice. They could smell it like bloodhounds. Me and my kids do, anyway. I think it was when she started low-key insulting my mom.
Lila never brings you over often enough. Why don't I see my lovely nephew more?
Etc. That I first saw the cracks in her facade. It was getting close to lunchtime and Grandpa was laying me out some graham cracker spread with peanut butter. Oh, no. That would never do for a growing boy. Carol would take me out to get a burger, fries, any kind of treat I wanted. Grandpa pondered. Mom had given explicit instructions not to let me go anywhere around Carol unassisted, but in his mind all his children's problems were the same and they just needed to get over it. I wasn't eager to go anywhere with Carol, but Grandpa, a beloved and trusted adult, told me it was okay. As I put on my seatbelt, Carol babbled all the nice things she was going to get me. I wanted a burger. I'd get a deluxe. Mom didn't let me have a whole thing of fries. I'd get the jumbo, and a shake, and a toy. I've mentioned Carol's tendency to build you up only to disappoint you. I was with her up until she started talking about dessert, saying I wasn't really that hungry. Well, that just made Carol determined to spite my mother. I probably just wasn't used to eating normal portions. Poor baby. I will say this. She held to her word that she'd get me food. Nowhere near the feast she'd been promising, but food. She even got me a toy, which I didn't even want or ask for, and it was the girl toy to boot. And waited there in the drive-thru, horns honking behind us, so she could watch me take my first bite. She made a lot of exaggerated yummy noises at me and drove off. As soon as she got me fed, she was going to take me to the store and buy me a nice toy, and then we'd go get some clothes so I stopped looking so shabby. This was my first glimpse into the depths I was currently adrift in. I said I didn't want new clothes. I liked the clothes I was wearing. Of course I needed new clothes. My mother couldn't afford nice things. That's why she was always begrudging Carol's nice gifts. I just didn't know what nice things looked like after all. I swallowed a fry, appetite completely lost, and over half a burger to go. And Carol, I don't want to go shopping.
Yes, you do. Don't be rude,
she said, running a stale yellow light. No, I want to go back to Grandpa and finish the railroad. Carol mouthed my words, waving her head back and forth as she did, mocking me.
You're spoiled, you know that? You don't know the value of anything.
I had only one card left in my hand. My mother told me to play it any time I needed to get away from Carol. I need to go to the bathroom. Carol frowned and slammed on the brakes. My neck still remembers that moment.
Fine,
she snapped.
Go right here.
We were not really close to a public restroom outside a little park. I remember dingy gray walls and metal toilets with no seats. I took care of business and went back outside. Carol waited like a responsible adult and made sure I got belted in before driving off, and we had a lovely time. No, she fucking drove off and left me. I wasn't even scared for a minute. I naively thought that Carol had probably parked and soon she would come around the corner and berate me for taking so long. I don't know how long I waited, but it felt like forever. I was stuck between staying where I was in case she came back or risking going to look for a phone. A guy drove up, a bit pudgy, baby face, glasses. He looked like your typical cubicle drone. He just stayed in the car watching me with a benign smile on his face. After a while, he got out of his car.
"Are you lost, little guy?"
he said. I was really nervous and I didn't like being called little. No. Just waiting on my aunt. The guy smiled bigger.
"Oh, good. She sent me to come get you."
He opened the passenger door.
"Go ahead, get in. We'll be there before you know it."
More than the mall kid, I had had stranger danger drilled into my head. I wasn't sure what this guy had planned for me, but it wasn't good. No thanks. His smile grew wider.
"Come on. I've got a G.I. Joe in the back. I promise I won't tell anyone if you want to come play with it."
Sure, I just gotta get my skateboard. I turned and marched stiff-legged through the park. I turned back twice. Once halfway, I saw the guy watching me go, shading his eyes with his hands. When I got to the other side, I turned around and the guy was gone. I had my telephone number memorized, but no one was home. Mom still happily running errands, thinking I was safe with my grandfather. I waited in a little shop while the storekeeper phoned the cops. They took me home and waited with me. I'll bet my mom had a heart attack when she saw the cruiser in the driveway, and another when they told her what happened to me. She called Grandpa and the old guy thought I was still out with Carol. My mom told him no, the police brought me home. I don't know how she kept her calm, telling Grandpa the whole story, but ended up convincing him of the truth. He was still making excuses for Carol, right up until she drove off and left me. Carol must have seen that I'd gone from the spot and, rather than face her father, must have gone straight home. Or she just went straight home without bothering to check on me. Equally likely. Mom called her house. Her voice was pure, sharp ice as she asked if Carol had seen me. Carol lied and said she thought I was with Grandpa. Mom said it was funny because Grandpa hadn't seen me since Carol took me out. Carol changed her story and said she dropped me off at home since I wanted to go. Mom said that I hadn't been at home. Carol changed again and said I'd whined about getting a toy in a store and then ran off when she refused. It was amazing. I'd never seen my mother do this. She was like a spider passing down loops of silk until Carol had woven her own noose. Finally, my mother cut the bullshit and told her cops brought me home, and that if she ever tried doing something like this again, Mom would string her up by her goddamn intestines. Carol started into her whole, "You can't tell me what to do, Dad says." Mom replied that she'd already told Dad what happened, and her bullshit wasn't going to fly today. Carol went silent. Then she hung up. I'm sure she bawled how unfair it was to her father over the phone. But for the first time in my life, Grandpa held firm, and Carol gave him a hefty prize, an apology wrenched from her pursed lips, a small victory in the long run, but still satisfying. Why does she do it? The same reason she dropped Kevin off with a Duck Dynasty-looking asshole. Because she sees children as things and has zero empathy for anything other than herself. I'm sure if that pudgy dude had ended up molesting and murdering me, she would have found a way to make it all about herself. Well, I've been talking and drinking with my Uncle Bob, and boy, oh boy, do I have a treat for you. Since Bob was the oldest sibling, he had more contact with Carol than anyone else living. Even better, he remembered Grandma when she was alive. I struck quite the gold mine with him, learned some very enlightening and disturbing things. I'll start with this anecdote, as it's probably the most lighthearted of all. So, Uncle Bob is one of those DIY guys. If he's not at work, he's in his garage. He was planing some wood with his garage door wide open when Carol rolled up, so he couldn't very well kill the lights and pretend not to be home. He assumed Carol was there to hit him up for money when she popped out of the car, all smiles. She got a dog. I've mentioned that Carol is a dog person. She usually takes better care of them than children, and that she actually pays other more competent people to take care of them, and Bob thought, sure, this would just be a semi-normal visit. Carol would suck up some narcissistic supply and leave. A dog, huh? What breed? Carol shrugged. Some kind of hound. She just went and picked them up. Bob knew instantly he had to tread with caution. This was probably some kind of theft or illegal trade that she'd partaken in without second thought. She'd just gone and picked him up. That's what you did with puppies in the wild, didn't you? Bob had a brain ache for that one. Not just that Carol was ignorant enough to believe dogs just roam free for the taking in the United States, but that it automatically fell to him to sort it out. He asked to see the puppy. Carol gladly obliged, opening the car's rear passenger door and frightening the bear cub huddled between the seats. Bob said he had an epiphany that moment, that no matter what low he estimated for her behavior, Carol would always manage to outdo him. Bob told her it was a goddamn bear cub. Carol laughed and said, no, it wasn't. It was a cute little puppy. He'd come right up to her and licked her hands, so she decided to take him home. Wasn't that nicer than that scary old park? Bob was looking at the back seat. The cub had been sick all over and was currently shivering. Bob was no vet, but he thought the cub was in some kind of shock and that Carol was potentially in a lot of trouble. And he knew who she'd try to drag down with her. Bob said she had to put it back. Carol made a face. Why? It would probably just die. She would take it home and feed it more candy bars because it liked them so much. Bob restrained himself from pointing out that her behavior would probably have killed a real puppy already, and just told her that taking an animal from a federal park was illegal and carried a hefty fine. Carol got sly and said she wouldn't tell if he wouldn't. Bob said it probably had a tracker in it, and the park rangers would probably tell it had gone off the grid. Massive bluff on his part, but it worked. Carol's eyes got wide and she asked if they could just cut the tracker out. Bob said no. It's probably in its digestive system or something. They should probably just put it back in the park and the rangers would write it off as a blip in the system. Using Carol's own ignorance on her is probably the most satisfying method of dealing with her bullshit, but my uncle warned me, they can bite you in the ass if you're not careful. Carol decided to return the cub. Bob drove because Carol is a menace on wheels, and directed them to the spot where she'd found the cub. It was so off the beaten path that Bob was surprised she hadn't taken out the tires driving to it. When asked what the hell she'd been doing out so far, Carol said she'd been looking for a pretty place to have a picnic. Yeah. When they rolled up on the little field where she'd first found the cub, Bob said he felt so sad when he picked that little body up and felt it shivering. He knew it might die, and if it lived, it would probably grow up to be a problem bear. But he also knew if he brought it to the ranger station that Carol would just throw him under the bus, somehow wriggling out of it like she always did. No, he planned to call in an anonymous tip that he'd seen some tourists messing with the bear cub and Carol was safely out of his hair. Carol stayed in the car while he picked the cub out of the back. He tried to hold it gently and make reassuring noises as he carried it out into the open, looking for a safe little hollow to put it in. And that's when he noticed the cub's mother on the far side of the clearing, 5 feet of shaggy Urson rage looking right at him. It broke into a gallop. Bob said his life flashed before his eyes in that moment. He dropped the cub, not his proudest moment, and just ran. The sound of the bear lumbering after him awoke all sorts of ancestral fears in his muscles. He ran faster than he's probably ever run to the car, where his sister had locked all the doors. Bob, operating on some kind of ultra autopilot, just fell flat and rolled under the car. The bear ran into the car so hard it rocked on its springs. Carol just kept screaming uselessly. The bear fished under the car for Bob. It had the longest claws he'd ever seen in his life. They looked like they could rip open human flesh like wrapping paper. They left deep furrows in the ground as it scratched after him. Bob joked that he regretted not shitting himself in that moment. The smell would probably have convinced the bear he was dead. He scooted over to the far side so its claws couldn't reach him. Carol continued to do nothing useful. The bear swiped at the passenger door, prompting Carol to shift to the driver's side. It lumbered around to the other side of the car, sniffing. Bob moved out of range again. Carol did the first useful thing she'd done that day and laid on the horn. The bear was startled. Carol leaned on that horn like there was someone going the speed limit in front of her. The bear lingered for a moment and then ambled off to the tree line. Bob waited for a few minutes after it vanished from sight, going deaf from all the honking before wriggling out from under the car. He told Carol to unlock the door. Carol said no. What if the bear came back? Bob took one look at that tree line, then told Carol if she didn't unlock the door, he would use a rock to smash the window in. Well, that got her to comply in a hurry. As Bob got in, he asked her why she'd locked all the doors before he could get to safety. Carol confusedly replied that she thought the tracker would stop the bear from attacking humans. And that, Bob said, is why you don't rely on Carol's ignorance as a failsafe. As he stopped at his house and got out, Carol actually had the nerve to ask him about paying for the damage to her car. Bob told her to tell the auto shop that the government was responsible. She'd probably get it for free. Carol drove off happy, and Bob went in and took some aspirin. Bob said he heard about a problem bear in the park not too long after. It kept attacking tourists in the area until finally the rangers had to euthanize it. Bob said he felt really guilty about that, certain that it was the mother bear they had screwed over. When Carol got a new Airedale puppy around the same time, Bob snuck into her house while she was out and grabbed it, took it to a no-kill shelter 5 counties over. It didn't help with the guilt, he said, but it was cathartic. Yes, Carol has burned through many a church in her day. How any right-thinking congregation doesn't take one look and come after her with crosses ablazing is beyond me. I've mentioned the nice folks that got on to her child-snatching tendencies, but there are more. So much more. The first ones in my memory are the Catholics. No, our family is not Catholic at all, and yes, she totally lied that she had been baptized into the church. She really went for all the pomp and the ceremony. She's a big one for ceremony because it's oppression with fancy decorations. So she started saying grace at every family meal, and Grandpa just thought it was great that his daughter was getting more spiritual and we should all go along with it. Let me tell you how Carol said grace. Each time was a long, rambling speech about how we were all wicked and owed the Lord fealty, and if you so much as sneezed, she would make a face and start all over, droning on and on while your stomach turned into a painful vortex of hunger. It was a 4th of July barbecue. Right after Carol had started over for the 9th time, that Uncle Bob broke. He started shoving handfuls of food into his mouth, chewing noisily and making faces so all the kids burst out giggling. Carol made cat butt face, but her spell was broken and she was powerless to do anything. That's probably what led to Aunt Amy arriving home one evening to find Carol and the priest sitting in her living room. The priest said her whole family read Carol, were concerned about her living in sin with a man she wasn't married to, and he'd like to talk to her about her non-existent drinking problem to boot. Amy took one look at them and said she hadn't invited them, and if they didn't get out right now, she was calling the cops. The priest immediately knew he'd gone out of his depth, but Carol jumped up and started screaming about how Amy's sin was bleeding into the family and tarnishing it. Amy got a glass of lukewarm tap water and tossed it at Carol. Carol fell to the floor screaming like it had been scalding hot. The priest shot Amy a look like a man who had stepped into a shark tank thinking it was full of dolphins. Amy ignored him and went into the kitchen, loudly counting to 20. By the time she got to 15, she heard car doors. Bob called the priest and lit into him when he got home that night, sending the final nail into Carol's Catholic coffin. The next lucky stiffs to get Carol were the Jehovah's Witnesses, and let me tell you, that was quite a romp. Carol not only stopped celebrating holidays, she decided we shouldn't celebrate them either. She broke in and trashed our Christmas tree. We couldn't prove it was her, but come on, But the real fun was my cousin Ellie's birthday. Now, JWs are allowed to celebrate anniversaries and birthdays, but Carol decided it was too fancy and accidentally fell on the cake Uncle Craig's wife had spent hours making. She chased Carol around with the piñata stick, and we let her because we figured she needed to blow off some steam. We weren't the ones who got her kicked out of the JWs, though. That one was all Carol. She was chomping at the bit to go and witness people, and I'll give you 2 guesses why. The person they sent to go door to door with her, I'm not sure what they call it, was alarmed at her car salesman tactics and general manipulation. She would barge into people's houses and threaten to have a heart attack unless they hurt her. The last straw was when she threatened a single mother with CPS unless she let them in. Carol was called into a meeting with an elder and ended up threatening the elder with reporting him for CSA. This brilliant tactic did not endear her to them at all, and Carol was kicked out. She hopped to the Unitarians next, lasted a grand total of 3 months before she accused a girl in church of having a drug habit. The poor girl had allergies and was the minister's daughter. Awkward. This is where it goes from funny to sad to horrible. At the Episcopalian church Carol joined next, there was this guy. Wife was separating from him and the church. Daughter was straying from the path. Black clothes, heavy metal, Tim Burton movies, typical teenager stuff. The guy was seeking help from the pastor, who told him the usual things you would hear in a case like this. Stay strong. Every kid goes through something like this. Keep the faith, etc. Then along comes Carol. Carol could not go without butting into everyone's business, so she knew all about the guy's divorce. How awful. His wife was an ungodly whore. She was rooking his daughter from the path of light. The pastor had recommended counseling. Carol said that his daughter was in too serious of spiritual danger for that. She needed an exorcism. I don't know how big exorcism is in the Episcopalian church, but if it exists at all, I don't think it's anything like the fiasco my aunt planned. She didn't need no fancy priest or holy water. They just need 5 strong guys to hold a tiny 14-year-old down while they screamed at her. I can't imagine what was running through this guy's head to let Carol talk him into this. Maybe he was just really grief-stricken about his family and struggling to put it into terms of his faith. Maybe he was a domineering tyrant who sensed his control slipping. Either way, he made the worst decision of his life when he listened to my aunt. I can't even imagine what they told the 5 guys to get them to help. Apparently, they were all otherwise upstanding members of the church. The girl arrived for her 3-day stay at her father's house. She left it on a stretcher. Carol instructed the 5 men to hold the girl down to a bare mattress in the cold basement while she went through the exorcism rite she had concocted out of sheer bullshit. She pushed verses on the girl, like actually tore pages from the Bible and pressed them against her. Spoke in tongues, doused the girl from a water bottle, all the while everyone was screaming at her to let the devil out of her. The girl kept begging to be let go. She was thirsty and had to go to the bathroom. Carol told the men that if they gave her anything, the ritual would be void and they'd have to start over. It went on for over a day, a grueling ordeal for everyone involved. When the girl passed out, they thought they had made progress. Actually, no. What really happened was the girl had undiagnosed type 2 diabetes and had just slipped into a coma. When they couldn't wake her up, one of the 5 men went to call an ambulance. Carol stopped him and said no. If they told someone, they would be seen as responsible. She told them to carry the girl upstairs and place her on her own bed, and they would call his wife after a few hours and accuse her of poisoning the girl. Well, the dad had a limit, and that one was it. He charged upstairs and called an ambulance. They got the girl to a hospital and managed to save her life. The dad lost both custody and the respect of his daughter indefinitely. And Carol, she spun it around so that most of the fault lay with the father. He's the one who wanted the exorcism. She really requested the 5 other guys because she wanted to protect the girl from her father. Well, in that horrible convolution that only happens around my aunt, everyone involved wound up excommunicated from that church. These are just some of the many, many religions tried out by my aunt over the years. The only denomination she skipped over were Judaism and anything involving brown people, because she is also fantastically racist. The only common thread between them is that she used them as a tool to pick at other people, much like holidays or her own son. Right around Bob and Amy's wedding, I think she was trying for the evangelical megachurch downtown, but as we all know, her only religion now is the nice men in white. The last two anecdotes have been relatively lighthearted. Today's anecdote is very not. You may get the impression that the whole family presents a united front against Carol. That's a little south of the truth. My mom and Uncle Tim resent Carol, resent being told to deal with her, and are generally combative. Bob is basically the pit prop for the family and hates it. He just tries to smooth things over because it's what his dad did. And Uncle Craig just wants to have a life to himself. Can't say I blame him. In dysfunctional families, there's this kind of false closeness brought on not by love but by obligation. What would bring other people together only serves to smother us. This story occurs when Tim is on wife number 2. He's in relatively good spirits, and as such, he's much more open to spending time with certain members of his family. He, Craig, and Bob all meet at Craig's house to have a go at the pool table, drink some beers, basically just do nothing. Craig's wife and daughter are gone for a girls' day out, and so when Craig hears a car door, he jokingly says,
"Here comes trouble."
And in steps Carol. Bob said every muscle in Tim tensed up. Tim and my mother sort of compete as to who hates Carol more. Tim has had more time to get sick of her, but then again, Carol never facilitated his near date rape. Carol seems unusually quiet. Craig tries to play the polite but distant host, asking what Carol wants.
I think I hit something with my car,
she says, and instantly they all know it's bullshit. She's hit something, and she knows it. She's just starting off small in hopes that it would soften them up. That might seem like a lot to get out of one sentence, but this is Carol we're talking about here.
You think?
Tim says flatly. Carol nods. They can see she's waiting for someone to ask about it, so she can foist the responsibility of checking it out on them. Tim shrugs, takes a gulp of beer.
Tell the cops.
Carol pouts a little.
I'm sure it's nothing. Probably just a dog.
Uncle Craig makes a horrible connection.
You don't know what it was. Didn't you have your headlights on?
Carol makes a sour face.
Why should I? The other cars use their lights. I can see plenty fine.
The three brothers stare at her. Carol's incompetent driving was a legend at this point, but this was a new low. Bob sighs, sets his beer down, and gets up. Tim grabs at his sleeve, shaking his head. Bob warily brushes him off. Uncle Craig rises too, and Tim makes an angry noise as he gulps more beer. He declines to join them outside.
It probably cracked the windshield. I might have to get a new one, but you should just install it because it's too much trouble to go to a shop.
Carol babbles as Uncle Bob snaps on the garage light. The flood lamp illuminates Carol's car, and the poor bastard currently sitting half in, half out of her smashed windshield. Bob shouts,
"Jesus!"
and drops his beer. Uncle Craig gapes at the car, and Carol? When Bob told me this, it sent chills down my spine. He said Carol was looking at them, watching them, reading their reactions. He could see all the cogs in her head working, parsing out how she was going to play this. It disturbed him, but what disturbed him more was that he knew he would be helpless to stop whatever it is. Tim comes out after hearing Bob shout. He takes one look at the car and whistles.
Carol, you asshole,
he says. Carol frowns.
It's not my fault. I didn't see him. Who crosses the road in the dark?
I'm disappointed that no one asked, well, Who the fuck drives without lights at night? Bob shakes his head.
We have to call the cops.
Carol makes an angry noise through her nose.
Well, that's too much trouble. Can't you just take care of it?
Take care of a fucking body? No, I goddamn can't.
Craig goes down the steps and starts looking the guy over. The poor bastard punched through the safety glass with his head. His face is barely recognizable under all the blood. Craig wriggles him out a little ways, trying to turn him over and get identifying information.
It's probably just a hobo.
Carol crosses her arms like a bitchy prom date.
No one's going to miss him.
That doesn't matter. Carol, you're looking at a charge of vehicular manslaughter. That's a very serious charge. You can't just...
The guy in the windshield lets out a groan. They all jump. The sound doesn't repeat. Craig bravely puts his hand to the guy's wrist. There's a pulse. Bob claps his hands.
Okay, look, we'll call the cops, an ambulance. If the guy lives, you're looking at a lesser charge. Maybe a suspension, some community service. Let's get him out of there.
Together, the brothers pull the guy out. He's definitely breathing, faintly, and he lets out another groan as they turn him over. Tim theorizes that the guy has severe neck trauma from hitting the glass. They shouldn't move him too much. Carol? Carol has this blank look on her face, arms still crossed. Bob said he thought she was coming to terms with what she had done, finally facing up to the future she'd laid down. Bob goes inside to call 911. Craig follows to get a blanket for the poor guy. Tim's fetching the first aid kit. Bob said there was this moment, while they were busy in all their little activities, where they all turned to each other and made a realization at the same time. The realization was that they had made a terrible mistake coming inside. Tim burst out of the house first. Carol is sitting with her arms crossed, just looking at the car.
I don't think you need to call anyone,
she said indifferently.
He's not making noise anymore.
The guy's head is sitting sideways on his neck, very decidedly not where it was when they went inside. Bob hangs up the phone. He said in that moment, he realized that this woman was not his sister. This woman had no relatives, no other person in her universe but herself. Tim doesn't mince words.
You fucking killed him.
No, I didn't.
Typical brilliant defense.
Tough shit, I'm still calling the cops.
Carol smirks.
I'll just say you did it.
Tim flushes red and charges at her. Sadly, Craig and Bob grab him and prevent him from killing Carol. Carol just shrugs and stands up.
Well, you deal with it.
She walks off. Bob wrestles Tim down. No easy feat. He tries to tell Tim they're stuck. They need to deal with it. But the Tim just keeps growling.
Why? Why?
And Bob doesn't have an answer for him. It was so ingrained into him to excuse everything Carol did, but he had no idea why. And this dysfunctional logic, upsetting the status quo, would be worse than covering up Carol's murder of a homeless man. Craig looks sick, but he doesn't object. He helps hold Tim while Bob explains the course the evening will take. They will smash in the windshield, collect all the glass and throw it away. They will take the body and throw it into the river. They will clean the car inside and out. No one will go to jail. Tim, stuck under their weight, eventually agrees. The dynamic between them changes then, and it changes forever. They don't talk as they load the poor guy's body up, along with the garbage bag of glass, and take it out before Craig's wife and child come back. When it's all over, Bob drops Tim off at his hotel. Before the door closes, he says,
Tim.
Don't fucking talk to me.
Tim snaps and slams the door. Carol gets a new windshield courtesy of Leland, who doesn't even question her bullshit anymore. Bob considers telling their father what had happened, what he had created by supporting Carol at the cost of his other children. And Bob knew at that moment if he told their father, there were two possibilities. One, things wouldn't change. Two, things would change. Horribly. He kept it inside him all these years, and to the best of his knowledge, so did his brothers. Bob begged me not to tell his wife. I said I wouldn't, if he would. Lack of communication was one of Carol's most effective weapons. It's what let her go on hurting people because no one knew what to expect. Bob agreed that if Amy hadn't left him yet, she probably would now. It may sound odd, but that wasn't the most shocking revelation from my uncle. No. That one would be the next one. The one from Carol's childhood. Uncle Bob told me this last. It's Carol's origin story, so to speak. And no, she doesn't become Carol by falling into a vat of radioactive bitanium. Bob said Carol has always been, well, Carol. He said as a toddler, she would look around sometimes and, finding no one paying attention to her, would fall to the ground screaming. If she couldn't get a toy, she would break it. She would fly into these rages, and the only way they'd stop was if Grandpa placated her with a toy or treat. Grandma wasn't mean to Carol, but she was cool to her. Like, Carol would throw a tantrum and Grandma would just shut off and walk out of the room. I think she recognized, even back then, that there was something bad in Carol, something cruel and greedy. Carol did not improve as the other children were born. If Uncle Craig started crying and no grown-up was around, Carol, now old enough to walk, would drag him to the closet and shut him in there. Bob said Grandpa would tell that story like a funny joke, and Grandma would get thin-lipped and silent. There's a lot of things, a lot of little things Bob isn't quite sure of, like how Tim once got a bunch of ant bites in the yard that had no ant hills before or since, or how toys would disappear and turn up in a cache, or never turn up at all, or the time they all got food poisoning after Carol demanded pork chops and Grandma made meatloaf instead. All things that look suspicious in hindsight, but no one could really prove at the time. But one thing he is sure of, one thing that Grandpa told him and then automatically made him swear not to tell anyone else, is this. Carol is a little under 10 at the time of the story. Grandma has become increasingly intolerant of her behavior, and Grandpa is always just trying to make peace, but as he works 9 to 5, he's not around enough to make much difference. On this fateful day, Grandpa arrives home to find Bob alone in the living room with the younger kids. Grandpa asks where his girls are. Bob points them outside. The house they live in is kind of out in the sticks. The yard is just a mown patch of scrub that transitions into trees with no clear line. Grandpa goes out to look for them. Now, there's this sawmill in the area. It's historical, meaning water-driven and rusted to shit, but it's still in semi-operation. Grandpa checks pretty much every conceivable area before he goes there, because what possible reason would the girls have to go there? Within seconds of setting foot in the mill yard, Carol skips up to her daddy. She's babbling excitedly, like a kid recounting a day at the beach, as she describes Grandma taking her up to see the logs come in, putting Carol's head on the track, and holding it there as the log comes sluicing down. Carol says Grandma pulled her back at the last second, but even so, Grandpa is disturbed. He gathers Carol up and takes her home, gives her a popsicle. Grandma comes home not long after. She's got a very wary look on her face. Grandpa decides that she's probably just tired and doesn't press her about the incident. He just vows to himself to take more care of Carol from now on. He told Bob this as if he had done Grandma a favor by not discussing her attempt on their offspring's life or getting her psychiatric help. They never spoke of the incident. Not once. Bob said his dad told him that's what a man's job was, being responsible for your family by shouldering all the burden. And then I had to tell him that part of the mill wasn't accessible to the public, and if it was in operation, it sure as shit would have had loggers who would immediately call the cops over a mother trying to commit familicide. I had to tell him that there was really no way they could have stood by the sluice either, as it's an elevated track. I had to watch his face as one of the cornerstones of the foundation of his life crumbled away.
Really?
He said quietly.
Really?
Yeah. I nodded. We took a field trip there for Jill's 6th grade class. Bob said,
God damn it.
I don't know if it was just hammered into him never to question what his father said, or if he subconsciously realized Carol might be lying but chose to believe in it because he needed to justify his father's behavior. He needed there to be a reason Carol was so messed up and why they kept enabling her. I'm sorry, I said, for a lot of things. Bob looked down, so I finally told him what we'd done on the day of his wedding. He started out pretty grim, but by the end he was smiling.
Hell, kid,
he said, slapping me on the arm.
You go and do what I never had the guts to.
Well, it wasn't just me. If it had been, I don't know what I would have done, but it was my girls. Would she put them in danger? That was it. I took a sip of my beer, which had warmed up the whole time Bob was telling the story. Bob looked a bit unsteady, and not just from the 7.6% ale we'd been guzzling.
I know I let your mom down,
he said.
I let Amy down, I let Tim down, I let a lot of people down over the years. And for what?
I shrugged. You loved your dad, plain and simple. If Grandpa had been the one to die instead of your mom, we wouldn't be here. I pointed at him. And may I say, he let you down first. Bob gave me a very small smile.
You talk too much sense, kid,
he said.
Where'd you come from?
My mom had me out of pure spite, I said, which made him choke on his next sip. I slapped him on the back and finished my long neck and called it a night when Aunt Amy came home. I made a point of looking at her and raising my eyebrows, and Bob made a fine gesture with his hand. I called my wife to come get my worthless ass. She agreed to after she was caught up on Walking Dead. I pretended to be freezing to death over the phone, and she told me to stick a carrot out of my zipper so she'd know which snowman I was. God, I love that woman. I walked around a bit, just mulling over all the things Bob told me. I don't believe Grandma was ever going to kill Carol. I really think she took Carol aside to try, once and for all, to read her the riot act, and it probably went as well as any time we tried to confront Carol on her behavior. I don't know much about Grandma. Mom was really little when she died, and whenever she would try to talk about a memory, maybe Grandma in the kitchen or tucking her in at night, Carol would butt in and say something like, "Oh yeah, then you cried so loud," so that my mom basically has no recollection of her own mother, untainted by Carol's bullshit. But from what I've been able to gather, Grandma was not the type of woman to murder her own offspring, even if it was Carol. Also, Carol goes apoplectic if you throw a glass of water on her. She would not be cheerful and chatty after an attempt on her own life, so Carol lied, pretty flagrantly, and with that lie, she bought a lifetime pardon. I can't condone Grandma's alcoholism, but if I was stuck in a marriage where my spouse would believe my attention-gobbling dumpster fire of a kid over me, I'd drink too. I think I'm going to tell my mom the story Bob told me today, and Tim, and Craig, and I'll tell the wedding story too. I'll keep on talking and talking, because not talking is what got us all in this mess in the first place. I don't know what I was doing in my kitchen at a little after midnight. I may never know. What I ended up doing was taking a slug of milk straight from the carton as I looked out into the dark of my backyard. Maybe it was my lizard brain rattling through 10,000 years of development to slap my frontal lobe. There is something moving in your backyard. My eyes had caught a bit of movement in the far corner of my yard. My tired brain pushed it off as a bit of someone's laundry on a line. It took me way too long to realize it wasn't just a bit of cloth. It was Carol. I bent and spit my mouth full of milk into the sink and then hit the deck. The fridge was still ajar behind me. I shut it and left the milk on the counter. I only saw a flash of her, but my brain had picked out a surprising amount of detail. Carol was draped in a white sheet that didn't leave much to the imagination. Her limbs were odd. Her left leg turned in, so she struggled to walk. Her hands were curved into claws, possibly stuck that way. Her head tilted oddly on her neck. I tried not to think of the homeless guy she'd run over and instead formulate a plan. I crab crawled out of the kitchen and then ran upstairs to my wife. Sarah was asleep. The TV's pale light danced on her closed lids. I shook her arm. She was not happy that I woke her. Made a noise like,
Bah!
"Carol's back!" I hissed. Almost instantly, she was awake.
Dang it!
She said.
That witch does not do us any favors, does she?
I guess her friends found out she wasn't all that pure. My wife rolled out of bed and hopped into her jeans.
That's it. I'm taking an axe to her. I don't care.
I shushed her. I told her about the state Carol was in, about the bushes I saw at the mansion. Sarah's eyes widened.
If she's immortal or some crap like that, I'm gonna be so mad.
I nodded. Look, I might be wrong, but just in case I'm right, I don't want the girls here. Sarah's gaze dipped. I could tell she was thinking about how possessive Carol was about other people's children. Also, I said, I want to check on Kevin. I don't know if she came after us first, but if she did, she'll probably go after him next. Sarah frowned.
So what do we do?
Right now, I propose we get the girls and get the hell out of here.
I do,
Sarah said, kissing my hand. We let ourselves laugh a little. Katie was still asleep. She made a little murmuring noise as I picked her up.
Daddy, what?
Jillian, in her bed across the room, sat up. Carol's back, I said. Get your shoes. We're doing a runner. Jill blinked and rubbed the hair out of her eyes.
God damn. Just call the cops.
She turned over and lay back down. Sarah walked in, tucking a pajama shirt into her waistband.
We're going, young lady. Carol's turned into some weird half-tree, and I don't want either of you around her.
Jill rolled over.
Is she serious?
You want me to take pictures? I was wrapping Katie in a big fleece throw. Yes, we're going to Uncle Kev's house, and we'll reconnoiter there. Jill must have realized how serious it was. She slipped on the Uggs she never wears out of the house. Katie stirred in my arms as we went downstairs.
Daddy?
It's okay, sweetie. Just be quiet for a minute, okay? The deadbolt clicked way too loud under my wife's hand. We shared a tense look as we gathered behind the front door. What if she was already out there? Jill had grabbed up the poker. Sarah held a hatchet in her free hand. The door swung wide, and our front lawn was free and clear. We wasted no time in surrounding the car. I unlocked the door and then hit the switch to unlock the rest, as the fob would have made the car beep. I settled Katie in and told Jill to help her buckle. My wife got in the passenger seat. I skipped around to get in the driver's side, waiting to put the key in until everyone was settled. Half asleep, Katie slammed her door. We all jumped. A thick, heavy thudding came from behind the house. Carol's gruesome mug floated over the backyard fence. She was so much worse in close-up. Her eyes had retreated back in her head so that you couldn't see the whites, just dark iris surrounded by baggy flesh. Twigs stuck out of her hair. Her mouth was the worst, though. It looked like it had healed over and then began to rip open again. She had no lips, just jagged flesh as she yelled.
David! David Benjamin Wilson, you get back here right now.
I started the ignition and slammed into reverse. I turned until we were parallel with the house, and with my free hand, I flipped Carol the bird.
You naughty boy!
She was still struggling with the gate latch. Her hands weren't just crooked, they looked like tree roots.
You naughty, naughty boy!
Something about that phrasing, about how she wouldn't swear even at times like this, just made it more disturbing than anything else she could have said. Hooting, I sped out of our cul-de-sac and onto the open road. Katie had buckled around her blanket.
Where are we going, Dad?
We're going to warn Kevin that his mom's back. Maybe plan what to do after that. I might drop you off with Grandma for a while. Jill crossed her arms.
How did she get back?
Hard to say. They might have let her go, or she might have broken out on her own. Either way, I don't like it.
She was scary.
Katie was shivering. I put my hand on the seat back. Don't worry, honey. Whatever she is, I won't let her get you. Jill was silent, watching out the car window. The streets were nearly deserted.
I want her to die.
She blurted out.
I don't care how bad that sounds. I thought she was going to die when we left her.
Me too, sweetie.
My wife was rapidly texting Kevin.
But we'll handle it, don't worry.
But you always say that, and then nothing gets done.
Sarah and I exchanged a look. I raised my hand. I promise, on my honor as a father, that we will take care of her tonight. If we don't, you get free pick of any family of equal or lesser value. Jill tried not to smile and punched my headrest. It took us 20 minutes to get to Kevin's house. He was waiting outside in his robe. As we got out of the car, he talked to my daughters.
Okay, girls. You're going to go with Tanya,
he said, pointing to where his girlfriend sat in her idling car. Tanya gave us a friendly wave.
You're going to go over to her mum's place. I made sure they'll have enough space for you while we talk it over. You'll be safe with her. Okay?
Jill looked from them to me. My wife stepped forward and gave them each a hug.
You girls be good,
she said.
And we'll bring donuts in the morning.
I looked at Kevin. Actually, I was going to suggest my mom's place. Kevin shook his head.
New orders came in. We'll talk inside.
I waved the girls off. Jill didn't look thrilled to be cut out of the excitement, but I knew they'd be safer away from us at the moment. Once we were seated around Kevin's table, coffee in hand, we started talking.
I told your mom what you told me,
Kevin began.
And she wants to deal with it. All of it. She said as soon as she gets off the phone, she would call the uncles. Maybe Ellie and Ty, if it comes to that.
I was kind of hoping to deal with this, I don't know, legally. She'll make it disappear. Kevin sipped his coffee agitatedly. I don't know where she's been, but she would only come back for one reason. To make us all miserable. Kevin.
No.
He said.
You don't know her like I do. It's all she lives for. It's like she literally can't ever be happy. I'm sure she just disappeared to spite us somehow.
Sarah and I exchanged a look. Then I did something I should have done a long time ago. I told him what we'd done. Kevin looked down at the table, nodded us. When we got to the mansion, he got it from the table. By the time we let the men in white take Carol, he was pacing. And by the time we got back, we were in shock, I said. And after a while, it just seemed better not to say anything. Someone might have felt obligated to look for her then.
You're damn right.
Kevin was breathing heavy. Kevin, I'm not...
No.
Kevin pointed at me.
No. You should have told me. I would have looked for her. I would have found that place and I would have shot her. I would have made sure she could never come back.
We let that sink in. Kev, I said. Not only would I not want you alone with her ever again, killing her isn't worth potentially losing you. Kevin let out a laugh that sounded like a sob.
It's true.
Sarah stood up and touched his arm.
I know you want to kill your mom. We all do. But there's no reason we have to be isolated on this.
I told Kevin Bob's anecdote. You see, we're not talking goddess. We have to move as a unit now, if we want her to go down once and for all. Kevin's eyes were wet. He rubbed them.
Well, good, because your mum called a war party. Her words, not mine. We're all supposed to meet at Uncle Bob's house.
You'll come with us, right?
Sarah tugged on his hand.
Right in our car.
Kevin blinked.
If I stay here, I could distract her.
Don't even, I said. You try that cliche bullshit, I'll tell your girlfriend you died choking on a mugwump. Kevin laughed, which sounded weird with his snotty nose. He gave us each a hug. We grabbed up some tools and away we went. Next stop, Uncle Bob's house. We barely spoke on the drive up to Uncle Bob's. I think we were all mentally fortifying ourselves for what had to come next. The one bit of conversation came from Kevin.
You know, I always thought it was somehow my fault.
He said quietly from the back seat.
Like, there was something I did that made her treat me like this. And I was stupid or lazy for not figuring it out.
Amazing how she fucks your mind, right? I changed lanes. Look, just because someone donates a chromosome doesn't make them a parent. It's not your fault she can't act like a human being. She was doing that long before you came around. Kevin gave a little shrug. He had leaned forward, so he dripped over the seat back with his elbows. Sarah touched his arm. Hey, I've got a tip. That guilt you're feeling, turn it into anger. Get angry and stay angry. It'll keep you going. It's what got me through my scumbag uncle's parole hearing. Kevin shrugged.
But I feel like if I do that, she wins somehow. Like, she brought me down to her level.
No, man. She wins by making you feel too guilty to act, and then you're more guilty for not acting. I turned off to the country road where Bob lived. Who cares about being on her level? You ever kidnapped a kid? Kevin shook his head. Ever tried to feed your dying father's flesh to his unsuspecting family? Kevin, now smiling a bit grimly, shook his head. See, there you go. No matter what she says, no matter what head trip she tries to lay on us, actions speak louder than words. Remember that. Kevin squeezed my shoulder. We were never as close as we probably could have been, but I've always kind of thought of him as the brother I never had. As we pulled into Bob's driveway, my headlights outlined Uncle Tim. Tim looked relatively jolly, long neck in hand. He gave me a rib-cracking hug when we got out of the car.
I always knew you were my favorite nephew.
He growled in my ear. Mom was at the door in a festive Christmas sweater, all smiles.
Hey, baby.
She pressed a kiss to the sides of me and my wife's heads.
War party's in effect. Grab some cider, and let's get started.
When I broke the news about Carol, I wasn't expecting this.
The truth never does what you expect, sweetie.
Mom pinched my arm through my coat sleeve.
Deal with it.
I stopped in my tracks when I came to the living room. When Kevin said she'd called everyone, she'd meant everyone. There was Ellie and Ty. There was Tim's current wife, all the uncles, my dad, Aunt Amy passing around a tray of crackers and cheese. Even Kevin's girlfriend, Tanya, had snuck in, shooting us a cheeky grin. I'll admit, I was kind of overwhelmed as I looked around the room. It hadn't occurred to me how big our family really was, and how many of us had been screwed over by Carol. My mom took up a fireplace poker and wrapped it on the coffee table.
The war party is now in session,
she said.
Now, I'd like to cede the floor to my son, who is going to bring us all up to speed.
I cleared my throat. Public speaking always made me nervous. I started with the wedding story, just in case someone had missed it. Then I segued into what happened earlier in the night, and already felt like another lifetime. I could see Tim's face seesaw between disgust and anger. Aunt Amy glowered. My mom set her jaw and played with the cheese knife from the snack tray, digging into the arm of the chair. And so that's where we are. I finished. I figured she'd go after Kevin next, so we brought him here. As to where she'd go after that,
here,
Uncle Bob interrupted. We all looked at him. Bob was looking down at his hands. Aunt Amy leaned into his back.
She pushed everything off on me,
he said.
Especially after Dad died. She'll come after me, to make me fix everything or punish me. Or both.
I sighed. Shall I tell them, or do you want to? Bob, still looking down, launched into the tale of Carol's hit and run. Tim's jaw tightened. Uncle Craig's wife looked at him, shocked. I don't think he ever told anyone about it. Tim either. When Uncle Bob finished, Mom shook her head.
So she just used you as a fixer since Dad died, and you went right along with it.
Tim took an angry swig from his beer.
Look, I know I fucked up, Lila, and I want to fix that tonight.
Bob ran a hand through his hair. Mom looked a little bit appeased.
How do you propose to do that, Robert?
Tim cut in.
Kill her.
A ripple went through the whole room. Certainly, we'd all been thinking it, but the people who weren't in so deep, Tim and Craig's wife, for starters, looked a little disturbed at the statement.
But isn't that just a little extreme?
Uncle Craig, always the voice of reason.
I mean, we can't do that, can we?
And I am so glad he phrased it like that, because that was just the opening I needed. I stood up to get everyone's attention. I was shaking a little from adrenaline and anxiety. I know your dad taught you that family's first before anything else, I said. But Sarah and the girls, they are my family. I'm going to protect them, no matter the cost. Should I do this? I don't have a lot of other options, but can I do this? Oh, hell yes I can. My mom was giving me a "I knew I raised you right" grin. My dad nudged my knee fondly. Kevin stood up.
I know I'm responsible for at least part of this.
Bob's face fell.
Oh no, son, no.
Because you didn't want to fuck up my life along with hers.
Kevin continued, speaking louder over the protest of his uncles.
But I've been thinking tonight, a lot, and I realized that this is what she does. She uses how much we care against us. She holds us ransom against each other.
His voice shook a little. I knew everyone was thinking about the custody battle.
She uses us like weapons? Well, I'm going to turn those weapons against her tonight. You don't have to join me in this if you don't want to. I'm just asking you nicely. Please don't stop me.
Of course, no one was going to speak against that. The man was a genius. Tanya stood up and hugged Kevin. My mom was next. Bob wrapped them both in his big bare arms. Tim just gave them a one-handed back pat. Craig stood and put his hand on Kevin's shoulder. No one spoke for a long time.
So what do we do?
Ellie blurted out. She seemed flustered. I could sympathize. She'd had to leave her 3 young kids with the babysitter too. I have to wonder how much Craig kept from her, protecting her in his own way.
She'll come here,
Bob said after disengaging from the hug.
I don't know how long it'll take her, but we'll meet her here. End her. Here.
Craig spoke up.
What if somebody stops her along the way?
You've never been that lucky,
Tim said.
Why start now?
It might take a while. Do we make weapons?
Tanya frowned. I've got an idea. I took my wife's hand. Why don't we tell some stories? We all looked at each other.
Sounds like an idea.
My mom said with a smile.
Who wants another cider?
We exchanged Carol stories. Some unknown, some making their first appearance in the company. It kept us alert and awake until we heard that heavy, wooden thud on Bob's driveway. We killed the lights and crouched down in Uncle Bob's living room. We could all hear the thump drag of something making its way up to the house. I risked a look outside. Carol was painfully making her way up to the house, her left leg digging up a long furrow in the gravel of Bob's driveway. Uncle Tim poked his head out beside me. He hissed over his teeth.
Jesus. I expected bad, but I didn't expect that bad.
Bobby!
Carol's voice rose in an eerie wail up to the house. I think the worst part of it all was that she still sounded like herself. The whiny, nasal screech that hit you in the spine like nails on a chalkboard.
Bobby! Get out here! I need you!
My mom joined us at the window.
Shit.
Suddenly, everyone wanted to cluster at the windows. Cousin Ellie turned white. Kevin gagged and had to put a hand in front of his mouth.
Hey! I know you're in there.
Everyone automatically fell away from the window.
If you don't come out here, I'm calling the police.
The good mood from earlier had evaporated. It's easier to say you're going to kill someone when they're far away. When they come up to your house looking like a half-ant nightmare, that's another story. Uncle Bob stood up at the fireplace. He was listening to Carol call and call, one meaty hand gripping the splitting maul.
Well,
he said calmly.
Can't keep her waiting, can we?
He nodded to all of us, picked up the maul, and walked out of the room. We followed him. I've mentioned before that Bob is a DIY kind of guy. His place is kind of like a candy store for makeshift weapons. If there's ever a zombie apocalypse, I'm running to Bob's place.
Are we actually doing this?
Ellie murmured as she contemplated a drawer full of chisels. I picked up a brick hammer and gave it a quick toss to fill it out. Well, I said, if it helps, don't think of it as murder. Think of it as clearing dead wood. We gathered at the garage door. Bob hit the switch. The door made a painful grinding noise as it rose to reveal Carol taking her last steps up to the gravel before she hit the lawn. Carol stopped, peering around. She didn't look like she could see too well, like she tracked us through sound.
Bobby?
She said.
Are you done hiding?
Oh yeah,
Bob said casually. We fanned out in a circle around her, giving her a nice wide berth. Carol kept cocking her head back and forth, searching with those piss holes and snow eyes. Her mouth holes showed signs of healing together and then being ripped apart again. Her words came out all pulpy mess like she had ill-fitting dentures.
Who's that, Bobby? Is David here? He needs to be punished.
Well, spank my ass and call me spoiled, I said, making her shuffle around to find the source of my voice. I do believe I am present and accounted for. Carol snapped her head back to look at me. The white sheet she wore wrinkled oddly on her body, like it was made from something other than fabric.
Bobby!
She wailed, turning back to him.
Look what David did to me.
She held up her gnarled branch hands. They looked painfully twisted and swollen, her pinky bent at an unnatural angle to her hand. Actually, she did that to herself, I said. I heard her. She said, I'm going with these nice young men to turn into a tree. Don't wait up.
Liar!
Carol hissed at me.
Dirty liar. You did this and now you're going to prison.
For what?
My wife called.
Getting back into his own car after you stole the keys?
Carol whipped her head around.
Sally, I knew you two were in cahoots. I'm going to get your children taken away and raised right.
No one had broken the circle. I knew we were all willing, but I don't think that anyone wanted to be the one to land the first blow. Kevin sighed.
Why couldn't you have just stayed where you were?
Kevy.
Carol turned to him. She moved oddly because of her stiffness. It gave her a touch of the uncanny valley. She tried to purse her ripped mouth as she spoke in her baby voice.
Kevy, baby, you need to help Mommy.
Kevin cleared his throat, making a production out of it.
Why?
He said. Carol's face twisted. Her bratty tantrum face was made terrifying by her makeover.
Don't fun me around.
She hissed.
You help your mother. You help me or I'll have to punish you, too.
Don't you fucking threaten him.
Tim snarled, hefting a ball-peen hammer. Carol twitched.
Timmy.
It's Tim to you, bitch.
My mom stepped forward.
And it's Robert, or Bob, not Bobby. Fuck's sake, he's 3 years older than you.
Lila?
Carol lifted her branch hand to point accusingly at her.
You raised your boy wrong. I'll see you sent away, too.
Why?
Craig stepped forward.
What are you going to tell the cops? How are you going to spend this, Carol? You look like a wide-awake nightmare.
Carol, now sensing the depth of the shit she was in, tried her other tactic. She folded in on herself, making herself look smaller.
You're all picking on me.
She whined.
I've done so much for you.
Like break up my marriage?
We all looked at Tim. He was seething. If we were taking bets, my money would have been on him to strike first.
You told my first wife I was cheating,
he said, white-knuckling the handle of his hammer.
You told a bald-faced lie because you wanted Mom's ring. You had 5 of her goddamn rings. What was one more?
Carol got indignant.
That never happened. You're imagining things.
You called the cops and told them I was molesting my children,
Craig said.
Just because I didn't want you to come on vacation with us. Do you have any idea what it's like to have your kids taken from you? Oh wait, you don't. You gave yours up.
I didn't.
And you almost got my kid molested.
Mom had a linoleum knife. She pointed it at Carol.
Remember that? The prom thing I could almost write off as an accident, but what you did to David was unforgivable.
He would have deserved it.
Carol exploded.
He was being rude. You're all being rude. If Dad were...
Don't.
Bob pointed the splitting maul at her.
Don't you dare invoke him. Don't even speak his name. He wouldn't have spent so much time protecting you if you hadn't lied to him about Mom.
Carol made a pitiful face.
It's not a lie. It's true. She really did try to drown me.
There was a brief moment of silence, and then it was broken by a sharp, pointed sound. Kevin had put his axe down to lean against his leg. Now he was slow clapping so hard it echoed off the house.
And that,
he said, picking up his axe again,
is the punchline. You can't even keep your story straight.
Carol kept opening and closing her mouth like a fish gasping for air.
Kevy, I'm your mother.
She simpered. Kevin's face hardened.
You sold me for the price of a facial and a new car once a year. Fuck you.
Carol's face twisted. She didn't really look human anymore.
You can't do this to me.
She hissed.
If I'm so bad, you're all worse than me. You let it happen. You can't just blame every problem you have on me.
No, but we can blame the problems you caused on you, I said. Like deliberately bringing my family into harm's way.
That's your fault.
She jabbed her bony claw at me.
You could have taken the keys away, but you didn't.
Okay, well, then you could have turned around and walked back to the car and not been turned into a tree, but you didn't, so that's on you. Carol growled.
I know people. I'll make you sorry. You can't do this to me. People will...
No one will do anything.
My mom cut in.
No one even noticed you were missing.
Carol's face fell, and in that moment, I could almost feel pity for her. The monster who never learned she was a monster. Maybe if Grandpa hadn't protected her from the world, she might have done something more straightforward, like become a serial killer or a torturer, but instead, she was only just now realizing that she had never fit in this human skin at all. Kevin's axe struck her in the collarbone, making a hollow sound, and just like that, it began. One of the first things we learned hacking away at Carol is that the sheet on her body wasn't a sheet, it was her skin, which put those hedges at the mansion in a new disturbing light. The second was that whatever happened to Carol, it made her body really tough. I hammered her bent knee with all my force and still didn't break it. The people with knives were struggling to cut her. Carol bellowed and tossed my wife away with one thorny hand. I stepped on her wrist and pounded on one of her fingers until it finally broke away. It grew back almost immediately. I didn't waste time gaping. I just kept hammering away. Kevin gave up on her body and took the axe to her face, just trying to shut her up. The whole time we were doing this, she kept trilling how naughty we were and how we were dirty, dirty liars, and my God, this woman was annoying even unto death. Bob spit on his hands, hefting the splitting maul, and buried it in her throat. Carol finally went silent, jaw flapping. Uncle Craig took his pickaxe dead center to her torso, opening up the white expanse for the first time. Now my wife, rubbing angrily at her bruise, made the hole bigger with her knife. Carol was wrong inside. It was more like a collection of vines and roots. No organs I could see. We kept chopping bits away from Carol, but they would regrow. We kept at it. Eventually, the regeneration started to slow down. We didn't. We took Carol to pieces on the lawn. There was no blood, not even sap, and some of the pieces still writhed. And this may sound a touch cliche on my part, but we never saw any sign of a heart. My wife touched my arm. Looking alarmed out towards the driveway. I followed her direction and saw a van drifting up, white and silent as a ghost. I ran to meet it. I had a feeling I knew who it was. The windows all had limo tint, but as I drew near, the driver's side rolled down to reveal a young man with eyes colorless and clear as the moon. "You let her go," were the words I panted out. The young man made a small shrug.
"She was not pure like you said."
I rubbed my aching shoulder. "Brother, you said a mouthful." He peered past me to where my puzzled family stood on the lawn.
"You have no one left. None of you are pure."
"Nope." I took a breath. "But we're kind of okay with that." The young man blinked. He turned to the other men in the van, which was packed full. After some silent discourse, he turned back to me.
"She is resilient now. If left alone, she will come back."
Thanks for the hot tip. Why are you telling me this? Instead of answering, the young man gazed at the mess on the lawn.
"She talked,"
he said.
"Exorbitantly, even after she started her becoming."
He put the van into reverse.
"We leave her to your care."
I waved bye-bye as the van backed down the driveway. My wife walked up beside me. Neither of us said anything. I just put my arm around her and held her. I write this now after everything is wrapped up. We parted ways peacefully that night, as a family. The four of us, me, Sarah, Kevin, and Tanya, crashed on the floor at her mother's place until morning. Jill was crabby the next day about missing the fun, but a box of crullers helped ease her mood. When we got back to the house, I had to laugh over the carton of milk on the counter. The girls looked at me like I was crazy, cackling over spoiled milk. But I was laughing too hard to explain. My wife called me a murderer. I called her tree hands. This time we both laughed. I think it was exhaustion mixed with relief. That, or we really are crazy. Is our family magically better? No. There's trust issues, infighting, the same crap that every family deals with to some degree. There always will be, but we're talking, and you don't know how good that feels until you've gone without it for a lifetime. We're not the best people. We can live with that, but since Carol's not around, we've been better, because that's what she really did. When she was around, kept us operating at our worst. In a way, Carol went home with all of us that night, after we had one more round of hot cider to chase away the cold and then went back to our cars. She'll stay with us as a reminder of what not to allow, where to draw the line, and I think of her almost fondly as I write this beside a fire, our merrily burning white twigs. Good night.